Silas Hargrove didn't bother to knock. He walked into the schoolhouse in the middle of the afternoon lesson, grabbed Vivian Ashcroft by the wrist in front of 30 children, and said, loud enough for every single child to hear, "You've seen something you weren't supposed to see. Hand it over, or I'll make sure this town forgets you ever existed." She didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye and said nothing. And that silence, that one moment of silence from a 24-year-old school teacher, terrified the most powerful man in Wyoming more than any gun ever had. If you're watching this and you want to know what happened next, what a woman with nothing but a leather satchel and the truth managed to do against men who owned judges, sheriffs, and half the territory. Hit that like button right now. Drop your city or country in the comments so I can see how far this story has traveled. And subscribe so you don't miss a single chapter of what comes next. Because this one doesn't end the way anyone expected. The afternoon, Silas Hargrove walked into Vivian Ashcroft's schoolhouse. The sky above Caldwell Creek was the kind of clear blue that made you forget the world could be cruel. It was the sort of October afternoon that seemed almost designed to put people off their guard. Golden light slanting through the windows, the smell of chalk dust and dried pine. Children bent over their slates with their tongues pressed to their teeth in concentration. Vivian was standing at the front of the room, reading aloud from a geography primer, when the door opened. She knew before she turned around. Something changed in the room, some shift in the quality of the air, the way 28 children all went still at once, the way even the birds outside seemed to pause. She turned slowly, and there he was. Silas Hargrove was not a man who needed to raise his voice. He was maybe 55, with the broad, patient face of someone who had spent decades learning that most problems could be solved if you simply waited long enough and hit hard enough when the moment came. He wore a good wool coat. His boots were clean. He stepped inside the schoolhouse doorway as though he owned it, which, technically, he might have. He owned quite a lot of things in Caldwell Creek. He looked at the children first, a slow, deliberate survey of every face. Then he looked at Vivian. "Class dismissed," he said. Not to her, to them. Not a single child moved. Vivian set the primer down on her desk very carefully, with both hands. "We have 40 minutes remaining," she said. "These students have examinations tomorrow." "I know they do." Silas stepped fully inside and closed the door behind him. The latch clicked with a sound like a small bone breaking. 40 minutes is plenty of time for what I need. One of the older boys in the back, Thomas Lund, 13 years old, the kind of kid who always sat near the door, shifted in his seat. Vivian caught his eye and gave him the smallest shake of her head. "Stay seated. Stay still." She looked back at Silas. "Whatever you need to discuss with me," she said, "can wait until after 3 o'clock. "No," he said simply. "It can't." He walked toward her, unhurried. The children tracked him the way prey animals track a predator. Without moving, without breathing, their eyes doing all the work. He stopped 2 feet from her desk and looked at her the way you look at something you've already decided to take. "I know you were in this county records office on Saturday," he said. "I know you spent 4 hours in the deed files. And I know you left with something you shouldn't have." Vivian's hands were flat on the desk. She could feel her own pulse in her fingertips. "I'm a teacher," she said. "I use the county records regularly for civic instruction." Vivian. He said her name the way men like him always said women's names. Slightly too familiar, slightly too soft, as though her name were something he'd already pocketed. "I'm going to give you one opportunity to make this very simple. Give me back what you took. Walk away from Caldwell Creek. Find yourself a position in another county, and none of this becomes difficult." She didn't say anything for a moment. She was buying herself time, which was a thing she'd become very good at without ever intending to. She was buying time and she was thinking, and what she was thinking was, he doesn't actually know what I took. He knows I was there. He doesn't know what I found. "I don't know what you're referring to," she said. He reached out and closed his hand around her wrist. Not hard. That was the worst part. He didn't squeeze, didn't twist. He simply took hold of her wrist the way you'd pick up an object off a table, and he said, in that same quiet voice, "I'm going to need you to come with me." 28 children watched. Not one of them moved. Vivian looked down at his hand on her wrist. Then she looked up at him, and she said, in a voice so steady it surprised even her, "Take your hand off me." Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, maybe. or something colder than surprise. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Probably." She kept her eyes on his. "But you're making yours in front of children, so let go of my wrist, step back, and get out of my school." For 3 seconds, she counted, he held on. Then he let go. He stepped back. He adjusted the cuff of his coat. He looked at her with an expression she would remember for years. Not anger exactly, but a kind of patient, settled certainty, as though he'd already decided on the ending and was only mildly inconvenienced by the current scene. "Wednesday," he said. "That's how long you have." He walked out. The door swung shut behind him. The latch clicked again. For a long moment, no one in the room moved or spoke. Then Thomas Lund, from the back, said very quietly, "Miss Ashcroft, are you all right?" Vivian turned back to her desk and picked up the geography primer. Her hands were not entirely steady. She noticed this the way you notice a small crack in something you thought was solid, with a kind of distant, focused attention. "We still have 40 minutes, she said. "Open your readers to page 63. She didn't go home after school. She went to the livery stable on the far end of town, where her horse was kept, and she stood in the stall with the animal for a long time. The horse, a brown mare named Clover, that had belonged to Vivian's mother and was deeply opinionated about most things, nudged her shoulder once and then stood quietly. Vivian was thinking. The ledger was at her boarding house. It was inside a hollow compartment in the bottom of her traveling trunk, the kind of trunk with a false bottom that her father had made for her before she left Missouri, because he'd said a young woman traveling alone should have a place for things she didn't want everyone to see. She had thought, when he built it, that he was being sentimental. She had never imagined the compartment would matter. The ledger was a record of payments. Payments from Silas Hargrove's land company to a county deed clerk named Elbert Fossey. Payments corresponding, date by date, to the reassignment of ranch deeds across 4 counties. And beside each payment, in the same careful hand, the names of the families who had lost their land. The Lindquist family, 640 acres. The Bauer family, 480 acres. The Crow family, a mixed-blood ranching family that had worked their land for 30 years, 1,200 acres, 17 families in 4 years. She had also found, in a separate folder tucked behind the payment ledger, a letter. The letter was brief. It was addressed from Silas to Elbert Fossey. It said, in plain language, that a settler named Amos Telford had become a problem and should be handled in the usual way. 3 months later, according to the county death record she'd checked before leaving, Amos Telford had died in what was recorded as a riding accident. That was what Vivian had taken. She had not known, when she first began looking into the deed records, that she would find this. She had been researching a lesson on frontier land law. She had not gone looking for murder, but she had found it, and she had taken the only physical evidence, and now Silas Hargrove knew she'd been in that room, and she had until Wednesday. She put her forehead against Clover's warm neck and stood there for a moment. Then she straightened up, went back into town, and went to see the county sheriff. His name was Deke Haller, and he had been sheriff of Caldwell Creek for 11 years. He was a broad man with a gray mustache and the tired eyes of someone who had stopped expecting much from the world some time ago. He listened to Vivian with his hands folded on his desk and his expression very carefully neutral. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You took documents from the county records office," he said. "I took documents that constituted evidence of a crime." "That's not really how it works," he said. "You can't just decide something's evidence and take it." "I understand the legal complexity," Vivian said. "I'm asking you to open an investigation into the land transfers. I'm offering you physical evidence of fraud and potential. Miss Ashcroft." He leaned back. "Silas Hargrove has been a landowner in this territory for 30 years. He employs—" "I know what he employs," Vivian said. "I know what he employs and I know what he pays, including what he paid Elbert Foss, and I have documentation of—" "Where are these documents now?" She paused. "Safe." "You brought them with you?" "No." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Ashcroft, I want to be straight with you. You're a well-regarded woman in this community. You're a good teacher and people think highly of you. I don't want to see you get into trouble over something that may not be what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like. Silas Hargrove is not a man you want as an enemy." "He already is," she said. He came into my school this afternoon and put his hand on my wrist in front of 30 children and told me I had until Wednesday. That's a threat, Sheriff Haller. I'm asking you to do something about it." He said nothing. The silence stretched out long enough that she understood exactly what kind of silence it was. She stood up. She picked up her coat and her bag. "Thank you for your time," she said. She walked out of the sheriff's office and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the cooling afternoon air. A wagon went past. Two women she knew from church nodded to her. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. She thought about Wednesday. Then she went to the boarding house, packed a bag, took the ledger and the letter from the false bottom of her trunk, put them in her leather satchel, and left. She didn't go anywhere in particular at first. She just started walking. There was a logic to it, though she didn't examine it too closely at the time. The boarding house was known. Silas knew where she lived. The school was known. The livery was known. If she stayed in any of those places, she was easy to find, and Silas's men were presumably not bound by the same timetable he'd offered her. Wednesday was what he'd said to her face. She had no way of knowing what he'd said to the men who worked for him. She took the east road out of town at first, then cut north through a dry creek bed when she was sure no one was behind her, then west through a stand of aspen that was still showing its last bits of gold in the fading October light. She wasn't a wilderness woman. She was a school teacher from Missouri who had come west at 21 because a teaching position had been advertised, and she'd wanted to see what the frontier looked like. She knew enough to find water and to read the stars for direction, but she had no weapon and no plan beyond "don't be where they expect you to be." She walked for 3 hours. By the time the light was fully gone, she was in a narrow valley she didn't recognize, following the sound of running water, and she was beginning to understand that not having a plan was itself a plan, and it was not a very good one. She sat down on a rock beside the creek and opened her satchel and checked the ledger in the dark. It was still there. She knew it was still there, but she checked anyway because some things you need to verify with your hands, even when you know them with your head. She thought about the Telford family. She thought about Amos Telford dying in a riding accident. She thought about the other 17 families and their names written in that careful hand beside payment amounts that represented their entire lives. She wasn't cold yet, but she would be. She wasn't hungry yet, but she would be. She didn't have a clear route or a destination or anyone who was expecting her anywhere. She sat there and looked at the dark water moving over the rocks, and she said, out loud to no one, "All right, think." She was still thinking when she heard hoofbeats. She was on her feet instantly, satchel against her chest, moving toward the tree line. The hoofbeats were coming from the south, from the direction of the valley's open end, not from behind her, which meant whoever it was had come from the road, not from tracking her trail. That didn't necessarily mean anything good, but it didn't necessarily mean Silas either. She got herself behind a stand of scrub pine and stood very still. The rider came into view in the moonlight, a single figure on a dark horse, moving at a steady walk, not rushed, not searching. He came to the creek and let the horse drink, and she could see well enough in the pale light to see that he was a big man, broad-shouldered, wearing a worn hat that had lost any argument with weather some time ago. He sat the horse easily, the way men sit horses when horses are simply how they move through the world. He didn't look around. He just sat there while the horse drank. She should have stayed hidden. She knew that. The sensible thing, the safe thing, was to wait until he moved on and then continue in a different direction. She had no reason to trust a stranger on a dark trail any more than she had reason to trust anyone else. But she was also 3 hours from town, alone, in a valley she didn't know, without a weapon, with documents that could get her killed, and with no plan beyond the next 20 minutes. She stepped out from the trees. He heard her immediately, turned his head toward her without startling the horse, which told her something. A man who doesn't startle his horse when something unexpected moves in the dark is a man with a certain kind of composure. "I can hear you," he said. Not threatening, just information. "I know," she said. She stayed where she was, 5 or 6 feet from the tree line, where he could see her but she could still run. He turned the horse slowly to face her direction. In the moonlight she could see a plain face, a jaw that needed shaving, and eyes that were doing the same thing her eyes were doing, taking inventory. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said. "So are you." "I live about 3 miles that direction." He gestured vaguely north. "I was checking fences." "At night?" I found a break this morning and didn't get to it during daylight. He looked at her satchel, at her boots, at her coat. You're not dressed for camping. No. You from Caldwell Creek? She weighed that. I was. Something shifted in his expression. Not suspicion, more like recognition, though not of her specifically, the recognition of a situation. You running from something? He asked. That's a personal question. Sure is, he agreed. He didn't push it. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out something wrapped in cloth and held it across the distance toward her. It's just bread and some dried meat. You look like you could use it. She didn't move. I'm not going to bite you, he said, and I'm not going to drag you anywhere. You can take the food or not, but if you're heading somewhere, you should eat something first. She walked forward and took the cloth bundle. She opened it. It was exactly what he'd said. She sat down on the nearest rock and ate, because she was hungrier than she'd admitted to herself, and he sat on his horse above her and didn't speak for a while. When she'd eaten half of it, she said, What's your name? Garrett Boone. Vivian Ashcroft. I know who you are, he said. You taught my neighbor's kids last year, Callum Ferris. His daughter came home knowing how to do long division, and he was very impressed. Despite everything, she almost smiled. Emma. She was very motivated. She wanted to outdo her brother. He paused. What happened? She looked up at him. What makes you think something happened? Because you're sitting beside a creek in the dark, eating a stranger's bread, and you're holding that bag like it's got something in it worth dying for. The almost smile faded. It does, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You going somewhere? I don't know yet. You got somewhere safe to be? No. He sat with that for a minute. The horse shifted its weight. Somewhere up the valley, an owl called once and fell silent. I've got a ranch, Garrett said finally. Small, nothing fancy. I've got a room with a door that locks and a dog that bites strangers. Nobody's going to come looking for you there tonight, at least. He paused. I'm not offering anything else. Just that. She looked at him. She was trying to read him the same way she'd been trying to read Silas that afternoon, and the feeling was entirely different. This man was not calculating the ending. This man was looking at a woman alone in the dark and offering her a room and making it clear that was the full extent of it. You don't know what you'd be getting into, she said. Probably true, he said. Tell me. So she told him. Not everything. Not the letter about Telford, not the full detail of the ledger, but enough. She told him about Silas and the land records and the sheriff who'd done nothing and the Wednesday deadline and the 30 children who'd watched a powerful man grab her wrist in front of their desks. When she finished, Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Silas Hargrove, he said, and his voice had changed slightly. Not dramatically, but the way a room changes when a window is opened and cold air comes in. You know him. I know of him. He looked out across the dark valley. He made an offer on my land last spring. Very polite offer. I said no. He didn't push. He said he'd ask again when I was ready. His jaw worked. Now I'm wondering what ready was supposed to mean. Vivian looked at the cloth bundle in her hands. She folded it carefully and held it out to him. Keep it, he said. She tucked it into her coat pocket. You should know, she said, that helping me means making an enemy of him. Seems like he's already got me on a list, Garrett said. He picked up his reins. Come on, it's getting cold. She stood up and looked at him. The stranger with the worn hat and the steady horse, who had offered her bread in the dark and a room with a lock, who had just made a decision about his own life without any apparent drama. Why? She asked. Not skeptical, genuinely asking. He thought about it. Because you looked me in the eye when you talked to me, he said. Silas Hargrove can't do that for 30 seconds without calculating something, and because you're out here alone and you shouldn't be. He reached down and she took his hand and swung up behind him on the horse, the satchel pressed between her arm and her body, the ledger solid against her ribs. They rode north. Behind them, back toward Caldwell Creek, lights were moving through the dark valley. Lanterns, maybe. Or torches. Hard to tell at this distance. Neither of them looked back. The ranch was small. He hadn't lied about that. It was a low house with a stone chimney, a barn that needed new boards on one side, and a yard that had the particular look of a place maintained by one person who had too many other things to do. A large gray dog came out of the darkness and stopped 4 feet from Vivian and regarded her with professional suspicion. "His name is Walt," Garrett said. "Walt, cut it out." Walt continued to regard her. Vivian looked at the dog. "Hello, Walt." Walt sneezed, apparently reaching some conclusion, and walked away. Inside the house was spare and clean. A main room with a fireplace, a table with 2 chairs, shelves of tools and books, and canned goods mixed together with no apparent organizational principle. Garrett got a fire going while Vivian stood near the door and took inventory of the space the way she'd been taking inventory of everything since that afternoon, looking for exits, looking for weak points, looking for what could be used and what couldn't. "Rooms through there," he said, nodding at a door. "There's a bar for the inside, lamps on the table in there." "Thank you." She didn't move immediately. I was crouched by the fire, feeding it kindling, and she was watching the back of his head and thinking about the ledger and thinking about Wednesday and thinking about what it meant that the only person in Caldwell Creek who had done anything when she needed help was a man she'd met an hour ago beside a dark creek. "The sheriff won't help," she said. "I know. He's probably already told Silas I came to him." "Probably." Garrett sat back on his heels. The fire was going now. He looked at it for a moment. "You need to get that ledger somewhere Silas can't touch it. A judge, a federal marshal, someone outside his reach. The nearest federal marshal is in Laramie, about 60 miles, through mountain passes that his riders know better than I do." Garrett nodded, slowly. He was working through it the same way she'd been working through it, not panicking, not dramatizing, just thinking it out. "I know those passes too," he said. She looked at him. "I grew up in those mountains," he said. "There are routes through there that aren't on any map. Silas's riders mostly stick to the main trails because the horses don't know the others." He paused. "I'm not saying it'd be easy. It's October. Those passes get cold, and they get narrow, and they're not forgiving. Can you get us through?" He turned and looked at her properly for the first time since they'd gotten off the horse. Not assessing, just looking. "I think so," he said. "I don't make promises I'm not sure I can keep." "That's honest." "It's the only thing I know how to be." She sat down at the table. The fire was warm now, and the tension in her shoulders was easing fractionally, the way tension eases when you stop running and actually sit with the problem. "If I go back," she said, "he'll take the ledger and destroy it. The families who lost their land will never get it back. The man who killed Amos Telford will never answer for it. And Silas will go on doing exactly what he's been doing because there's no one left to stop him." Garrett was quiet. "That's what I'm carrying," she said. "Not just paper, all of that." "I understand what you're carrying," he said. "Then you understand why I can't turn back." "I do." He stood up. "We'll leave at first light. I know a man on the northern route who will let us rest the horses. After that, it's open country until we hit the pass." He looked at her steadily. "Get some sleep if you can. You're going to need it." She nodded. She stood, picked up her satchel. "Garrett," he looked at her. "I'm not going to pretend this is a small thing I'm asking." "You didn't ask," he said. "I offered." He picked up his hat from the table. "I'll be in the barn. Walt sleeps at the front door. Don't let him on your bed. He takes up the whole thing." He went out. She stood in the firelight for a moment, the satchel in her hands, and then she went to the small room and barred the door and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and opened the satchel and looked at the ledger and the letter. 17 families. Amos Telford died in a riding accident, Wednesday. She put the documents back in the satchel and set it on the floor where she could reach it in the dark. She lay down, fully clothed, and listened to the fire dying in the next room and the wind picking up outside and Walt shifting somewhere near the front of the house. She didn't sleep for a long time, but eventually she did. And when she woke before dawn to the sound of Garrett moving in the yard and the cold gray light beginning at the edges of the window, she got up, straightened her coat, checked the satchel, and felt something she hadn't felt since that afternoon in the schoolhouse. Not safety, not certainty, but something slightly stronger than alone. They left before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Garrett had the horses ready when Vivian came out of the house. Clover had apparently been collected from somewhere. Or perhaps he'd gone to get her in the dark hours before dawn. She didn't ask. He handed her a bedroll strapped tight and a canvas bag with food in it, and he didn't say good morning, and she didn't either, and that suited them both fine. Walt sat in the yard and watched them go with the expression of a dog who had seen people do foolish things before and expected to see it again. The first hour was mostly silence, not uncomfortable silence, the kind that comes when two people are both thinking hard and have agreed, without saying so, to let the thinking happen. The trail north from Garrett's ranch was narrow and rocky, threading through stands of bare aspen and climbing gradually toward the higher country. The cold was serious. Vivian could see her breath, and Clover's breath, and Garrett's breath, all mixing together in the gray morning air. She was watching the trail behind them. "Nobody back there yet," Garrett said, without looking around. "You can't see the trail from here." "I know this land," he said. "I can hear it. Riders make a different sound than wind through brush. Nothing's following us yet." She turned forward again. "Yet." "Yet," he agreed. He wasn't trying to comfort her, which she appreciated. Men who tried to tell you everything was fine when clearly everything was not fine were a particular kind of exhausting, and she didn't have the patience for it. They rode another mile before he said, "How'd you end up in Caldwell Creek? You're not from Wyoming." "Missouri. My father taught school. When I was 18, he said I could either go to a teacher's college in St. Louis or get married, and I chose teacher's college. Then when I graduated and they advertised the position out here, I wanted—" She paused, looking for the right word. "I wanted to see what was out past the edge of things." "And?" "And it turns out what's out past the edge of things is harder and more interesting than most people tell you, and occasionally a man tries to grab your wrist in front of 30 children." Garrett made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was in that neighborhood. "Why'd you go into the deed records? You said it started as research." "There was a family, the Beckers. They had a girl in my class named Ruth, 11 years old, bright as anything. In September, they just disappeared. I asked around and people said their land had been sold, that they'd moved on. But Ruth had never mentioned moving, and she'd never said goodbye, and—" She stopped. "It bothered me. So I started looking. And you found the ledger." "I found the ledger." She adjusted the satchel on her shoulder. "I found Ruth Becker's family in the records with their deed transferred to a holding company that traced back to Silas. I found 16 other families the same way. And then I found the payment records, and then the letter about Telford, and then I stopped being a teacher doing civic research and started being a woman who knew something she very badly wished she didn't." Garrett was quiet for a while after that. "The Becker family," he said. "You know where they went?" "No." "I might. There was a family by that name, woman, 3 kids, no husband, that moved into a work camp outside of Rawlins about 6 weeks back. Someone mentioned it at the feed store." He glanced at her. "Could be them." She felt something tighten in her chest. "If it is, they'd be witnesses," he said. "Families who lost the land, who can say what happened. The ledger matters, but people who'll stand up in a courthouse matter more. That's a long road from here. Everything worth doing is." It was a plain statement, said without any particular weight to it, and it was the kind of plain true thing that stuck in her head the way plain true things did. They crested a low ridge, and the country opened up ahead of them. A long, high valley still touched with early frost, the mountains rising in the northwest with their highest peaks already white. It was the kind of landscape that made you feel very small, and this morning that feeling was not entirely unwelcome, because feeling small was at least a change from feeling hunted. "We'll stop at the Ferris place," Garrett said. "Callum's a solid man. He'll give us hot food and information. He'll know if anyone's been asking after you in the valley." "Is it safe to stop there if Silas's men come?" "Callum's got 6 sons and a rifle for each of them," Garrett said. "Silas's riders don't linger where they're not welcome." She thought about Emma Ferris and her long division. She thought about all the children she'd taught whose families were out here in this country, trying to hold on to their land and their lives. And she thought about how Silas Hargrove had looked at her in the schoolroom with that patient, settled certainty. She gripped the satchel tighter. They rode on. The Ferris ranch was bigger than Garrett's, a proper house with a covered porch, 2 barns, and the evidence of 6 sons in the form of scattered boots, tools, and an argument audible from 50 yards about who had left a gate open. Callum Ferris came out onto the porch before they reached the yard, squinting at them in the morning light. He was a lean, weathered man with rust-colored hair going gray and he had the rancher's habit of looking at horses before he looked at people. "Garrett," he said. Then he looked at Vivian, and something in his expression changed. Not alarm, but a kind of careful attention. "Miss Ashcroft." "Morning, Callum." "Come inside." He said it without asking any questions, which told her that either he already knew something or he was the kind of man who understood that questions could wait until people were off their horses and warm. It turned out to be both. Callum's wife, May, had them fed within 20 minutes, coffee and biscuits and salt pork. And while they ate, Callum stood at the window and told them, without being asked, that 2 riders he didn't recognize had come through the valley yesterday evening. They'd stopped at the Hendersons' place, half a mile south, asking if anyone had seen a young woman traveling alone. They'd described Vivian accurately enough: her height, her dark hair, the leather satchel. "Henderson sent them north," Callum said. "Told them he'd seen someone heading up toward the main pass." "That's not where we're going," Garrett said. "I know that." Callum turned from the window. "Where are you going?" "Laramie, the back way." Callum absorbed this. "Through Archer's Canyon?" "Part of it, then across the upper flats and down through the Henderson Draw. The old one, not the new trail. It's longer, but nobody uses it." May, who had been quiet at the stove, said without turning around, "How long?" 3 days, maybe 4, depending on weather." "Snow coming," Callum said. 2 days, I'd say. Maybe less." Vivian looked at Garrett. He was looking at Callum, and she could see the calculation running behind his eyes. The kind of quiet, practical mathematics that people who live in hard country do automatically. "We'll move fast," Garrett said. "You'll need another horse." Callum set his coffee down. "The mare's good, but she's carrying too much. You take the gray gelding. He knows the mountain trails, and he's got more bottom than anything else I've got." "Callum." "Don't argue with me about it," Callum said, not unkindly. "Emma still talks about Miss Ashcroft every week. She'd skin me if I didn't help." He looked at Vivian directly. "Those riders were asking for a fugitive. That's the word they used. Fugitive. I want you to know that I know what kind of man uses that word for a school teacher." Vivian met his eyes. "The kind who's afraid of what she's carrying." "That's what I thought." He nodded. "The gray's already shod. I'll have him ready in 10 minutes. May finally turned from the stove. She was a small, practical woman with flour on her hands and an expression that suggested she had navigated difficult situations by simply continuing to feed people until things resolved. She looked at Vivian. "There's a coat in the back room that'll fit you better than that one," she said. "It's got a proper lining. The mountains don't care how well dressed you are." Vivian opened her mouth to decline and then stopped herself. "Thank you," she said instead. May disappeared and came back with a heavy canvas coat lined with sheep's wool, and Vivian put it on, and it was warm in a way that made her aware of how cold she'd been. Garrett had gone to the barn with Callum. She could hear them talking, their voices low, the words not clear from inside. May was washing dishes, and the sounds of the sons had reorganized from an argument to something that involved a great deal of hammering from one of the barns. Vivian sat at the kitchen table and opened the satchel and removed the ledger and the letter and set them flat on the table and looked at them. She'd read the ledger a dozen times since she'd found it. She knew its contents the way you know something you've memorized not from intent, but from repetition. The names and dates and payment amounts had arranged themselves in her head in a kind of grim order. What she still came back to, every time, was the letter. The letter was so brief. A problem. The usual way. And a man had died. She heard a boot on the step and closed the satchel. But it was just May, who had apparently noticed and said only, "There's more coffee if you need it," and didn't press. "Can I ask you something?" Vivian said. May turned. "Go ahead." Has Silas ever come out to this part of the valley? Made offers? Sent anyone?" May was quiet for a moment. 2 years ago a man came. Very polite. He talked to Callum for about an hour about what the land was worth and what the holding company was offering. Callum said no. She folded the dish towel in her hands. 3 months later, we had a problem with the northern fence. Someone cut it. Cattle got into the hills. We lost 2 head. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama. Could have been anything, but Callum knows this fence. He built it himself. He knows when something falls and when something gets cut. Vivian nodded. "He didn't report it," May said, "because he knew what reporting it would mean. You go to the sheriff's office, and now Silas knows you're suspicious, and you've got a problem that's bigger than cut wire. She looked at Vivian steadily. That's what it's been like for a lot of families in this valley. You just absorb it and keep going, and you don't make noise because you don't know how big his reach is. Now you know. We knew, May said quietly. We just didn't have any way to prove it. She looked at the satchel. Vivian put her hand on it. I have 17 families worth of proof. May nodded. Just once, but solidly. Then don't lose it, she said, and went back to her dishes. They left the Ferris place with a third horse, Garrett leading the gray gelding on a line until they were clear of the yard, and the trail widened enough to ride abreast. The morning had warmed slightly, but the cloud cover was building in the northwest, the kind of high gray layering that Vivian had come to recognize as the serious variety. 2 days, she said, looking at it. Maybe less, Garrett said, same as Callum. We'll push today while we've got light. They climbed steadily. The trail they were on wasn't quite a trail. It was the kind of route that exists in mountain country because animals and experienced men have used it enough to wear a suggestion of passage into the land. But it wasn't cut or marked or obvious. Garrett rode it without hesitation, which told her he'd been on it many times. You came this way a lot? She asked. Growing up, yes. My father ran cattle up to the high summer pastures every June. We used this route to avoid the bottleneck at the main pass when everyone else was moving their herds at the same time. He paused. He used to say the back way was always the real way. The main trail is for people who don't know any better. Your father taught you well. He taught me some things and was wrong about others, same as anyone. She looked at him. He was watching the trail ahead with a slightly closed expression, the kind that forms around things you haven't quite decided to talk about. What was he wrong about? She asked. A pause. He thought the territory was fair, that if you worked hard and kept your head down and built something worth having, it would stay yours. He was quiet for a moment. He died thinking that. Left me the ranch. And then Silas sent someone with a polite offer a year after the funeral, and I had about 30 seconds to understand that working hard and keeping your head down was maybe not the complete picture. But you held the land. So far. He said it with a kind of measured weight that she understood. So far in this territory was not the same as certainly. I've got nothing like what you're carrying, he said. No proof. Just a gut feeling and a cut fence worth of suspicion. The ledger shows his payments to Fossey going back 4 years, Vivian said. It starts before your father died, but it might have expanded after. There are entries I haven't been able to match to specific families. If your land is in there, then it's in there, he said. We deal with that when we get to Laramie. He said we without noting it, and she caught it and didn't note it either. They climbed higher. The trail narrowed where it cut along a rocky face, a stretch of maybe 200 yards, where the rock wall rose on their left and the ground fell away sharply to the right. Not a cliff exactly, but not forgiving either. The horses picked their way through it carefully, Clover following the gray without being pushed. Vivian kept her eyes on the trail and her weight balanced and didn't look down, which was not cowardice but simply good sense. Halfway through the narrow stretch, Garrett stopped. She stopped behind him. He was looking down. She followed his eyes. Far below, a quarter mile or more, the main trail curved through a lower draw, and on the main trail moving northward were riders. She counted 4, maybe 5. They were moving at pace, not wandering. Those the same men from yesterday? She asked quietly, though they were far too distant to hear her. Can't know for sure, Garrett said, but they're moving like men who have a destination and think they know where they're going. He watched them for a moment. They took Henderson's misdirection north. That trail comes out on the upper plateau and runs toward the main pass. They'll be on it for another hour before they realize it doesn't connect the way they think it does. And then? They'll backtrack. They'll ask at the next ranch and get new information. He started moving again, the gray stepping carefully along the rock face. We'll be well ahead of them by then, but we need to stop resting and start moving. I wasn't complaining about the pace. I know, I'm saying it to myself. She almost smiled again. They cleared the narrow stretch, and the trail widened back into open mountain country. Rolling high meadows, the grass silver with frost, the sky pressing down heavy and gray. The wind had picked up and was coming from the northwest now, carrying the particular cold that was less about temperature and more about intention. They stopped only twice through the afternoon, once to water the horses at a clear stream running down from the snowfields, once to eat briefly and check the horses' hooves. Garrett had the efficiency of someone who had made long trips in hard country before, doing everything with a minimum of motion and none of the standing around that usually went with it. She found herself watching him the way you watch someone whose competence is unfamiliar to you, not with admiration exactly, but with a kind of professional interest. She knew competence in classrooms, in front of 28 children, in the management of lessons and small crises, and the enormous daily work of making young minds understand things. This was competence of a different variety, and it was useful, and she respected it. He caught her watching him once, checking a saddle cinch after the second rest stop. "What?" he said. "Nothing, just thinking." "About?" "Whether you'd make a good teacher." He looked genuinely uncertain how to take that. "Would I?" "Probably not," she said. "You explain things too simply. Children need more scaffolding." He stared at her for a moment, and then, briefly, completely unexpectedly, he laughed. A real laugh, not a polite sound. It lasted about 3 seconds, and then he went back to the cinch. "That's the most specific criticism anyone's ever given me," he said. "I'm a teacher. Specific criticism is what I do." He finished with the cinch and straightened up, and there was something different in the way he looked at her after that. Not warmer exactly, but less careful, like a door opened slightly. They rode on. By late afternoon, the trail had taken them into a different kind of country, a long valley between two ridges, sheltered from the worst of the wind, with a frozen creek running down its center and the ruins of what had once been a line camp visible against the southern ridge. The light was going fast. "We'll camp there," Garrett said, nodding at the ruins. "The walls are still solid enough to break the wind. There's firewood if you know where to look." "Do you?" Yes. There was, in fact, firewood, a cache of it under a fallen section of roof that had kept the worst of the weather off. Garrett got a fire going inside the roofless structure where two walls still met at a corner, creating a reasonable wind shelter, and Vivian unsaddled Clover because she'd been doing it since she was 15 and didn't need help. They ate from what May had packed: cold biscuits, dried meat, 2 apples that were beginning to wrinkle, but still had flavor. They sat across the fire from each other in the angle of the 2 walls, and the horses were tied nearby, and the wind moved through the ruins around them, and the fire was small enough to be invisible from the valley below. "Tell me about the families," Garrett said. She looked up. "The ones in the ledger," he said. "You said 17. Tell me about some of them." It was an odd request. Not what she'd expected. She considered it, and then she started talking. Not from the ledger, not from the records, but from what she'd been able to piece together, and from the children she'd taught. The Lindquist children, who had been at the school for 2 years and then simply weren't one morning, and she'd been told they'd gone north. The Bower boy, Carl, who had drawn pictures of his family's cattle on every piece of paper he could find because he loved those cattle more than anything, and everyone had known it. The Crow family. She'd never taught their children, they were in a different district, but she'd heard about them from other teachers, a large and well-established family, mixed blood, 30 years on that land. She talked for a long time. Garrett didn't ask questions. He listened the way people who genuinely listen do, with his whole attention, without the slight impatience of someone waiting for you to finish so they can respond. When she ran out of what she knew, she stopped. "I keep thinking about Carl Bauer," she said. "He was 9. He drew those cattle on everything. I've still got a drawing he did on the back of a spelling test. I packed it when I left because—" She stopped. "I don't know why. I just did." Garrett looked at the fire for a moment. "There are good people all through this territory," he said. "People who came out here and built things that were worth building. And it's not right that one man can undo that. For money. For land." He said the last word like it tasted bad. "He doesn't even need the land. He's got more already than he could ever properly use." "It's not about need," Vivian said. "I've thought about that. It's about being able to. Men like Silas don't want things because they need them. They want them because wanting and taking is how they know they're powerful." Garrett looked at her across the fire. "That's exactly right," he said. "I've had some time to think about it." "You have more—" He paused, looking for the word. "Vocabulary for it?" she offered. "I was going to say insight, but sure. They're not mutually exclusive." He shook his head slightly, and that almost laugh was there again. The fire burned lower. The wind found new angles through the ruins and changed pitch. The horses shifted and settled. "Get some sleep," Garrett said. "I'll take first watch." "You were up before dawn. So were you. I'm not the one navigating tomorrow." Neither of us is at our best exhausted. He picked up the blanket roll and tossed it toward her. "Sleep. I'll wake you in a few hours." She caught it. She wanted to argue but couldn't construct an argument that wasn't just pride, and she was too tired for pride. She lay down near the fire, the satchel under her head, and pulled the blanket close. She could see the edge of the firelight touching the base of the wall, and above the open roof the sky was thick with cloud. No stars, no moon, just the dense gray weight of incoming weather. She was asleep before she'd finished thinking about it. When Garrett woke her, the fire had burned to coals, and the darkness around them had a different quality. Not the thick black of midnight, but the pale, directionless gray that comes just before a winter dawn. She sat up immediately. "How long?"
"Long," she said. 4 hours, maybe. You should have woken me sooner. You needed it more." "You don't get to decide." "You're right," he said, simply enough that it stopped her. "I'll wake you sooner next time." She sat with that for a moment.
The acknowledgement was direct and without resentment, and she wasn't sure she'd encountered that combination before. She took the watch, and he slept. Really slept, within minutes, the way people who have trained themselves to sleep in difficult places can do. She sat with the coals and her satchel in her lap and watched the dark. About an hour into her watch, she heard something. Not hoofbeats, something closer. A sound in the ruins, in the section of collapsed wall behind her. She was on her feet with no particular decision involved, the satchel against her chest. "Garrett!" He was awake instantly. She pointed at the collapsed section. He was very still for a moment. Then he reached slowly toward the rifle that was leaning against the wall beside him. The sound again, a scrabbling, something loose and rocky. Then a very large owl emerged from a gap in the stones, regarded them with yellow eyes, and swept out over the ruins and into the dark without a sound. They both stood in the fading firelight, looking at the place where it had been. "Well?" Vivian said. "Yeah," Garrett said. He set the rifle down. She sat back down. Neither of them slept after that, and neither of them mentioned it again, but when the gray dawn came and they saddled up and moved out of the ruins into the cold, open country, there was something between them that was slightly different from what had been there the night before. Not ease exactly, but the beginning of something that might eventually become ease, worn into place by shared frights and shared silences, and the very specific kind of tiredness that comes from a night spent watching the dark together. They rode north. Above them, the sky was pressing lower and lower, and the first scattering of snow began just before mid-morning. Small, dry flakes that moved sideways in the wind and didn't amount to much yet, but were clearly the advance party for something more serious. Neither of them said anything about it. They just rode faster. And behind them, further than they'd been, but not as far behind as they needed to be, two riders crested the southern ridge of the valley and stopped, looking north. And one of them raised a hand and pointed at the fresh tracks in the dusting of snow on the trail. They turned to follow. The snow that had started as a suggestion became a fact by mid-morning. Not the worst kind. Not the heavy, wet snow that dragged everything down and turned trails into mud, but the dry, wind-driven kind that moved sideways and found every gap in your clothing and reduced visibility to a quarter-mile on the open flats. Garrett pushed the pace without being asked, and Vivian matched it without complaint. And neither of them talked much because the wind took words and shredded them before they got anywhere useful. She was thinking about the two riders she hadn't seen but knew were behind them. She knew because Garrett knew, and she'd read it in the set of his shoulders when he'd glanced back twice in the last hour without saying anything. He hadn't told her, which was not dishonesty, but the particular economy of men who don't speak problems aloud until they have a solution to attach to them. She'd decided not to push it yet. The trail they were on, if it could be called that, climbed through a series of rocky switchbacks that the snow was doing its best to erase. The gray gelding moved through it with the confidence of an animal who had done this before, which was reassuring. Clover followed with something that looked like irritation, which was also reassuring, because Clover being irritated meant Clover was paying attention. At the top of the switchbacks, Garrett pulled up. She came alongside him. From up here, through the thin curtain of blowing snow, the valley they'd camped in was visible below and behind them. and on the valley floor, following the fresh tracks in the dusting of snow, were two riders. She looked at them for a moment without speaking. "How far back?" she said. "Hour. Maybe less, the pace they're moving." I was watching them with a stillness that she was beginning to recognize as his version of concern.
"They found the tracks. Either they're better at this than I figured, or they got lucky." "Does it matter which?" "No," he said. "Not really." He turned the horse and kept climbing. She followed, and they did not look back again, because looking back was only useful if it changed what you did, and right now it didn't change anything at all. The canyon came up on them faster than she expected. One moment they were on the open high flats, the snow driving sideways, and then the land dropped away, and the walls rose on either side, and they were inside something, Archer's Canyon, she understood, which Garrett had named the night before. The walls were sandstone and limestone layered in bands of red and tan and gray, streaked with moisture where the snow was finding cracks and melting on contact. The wind dropped the moment they were inside, and the sudden quiet was almost physical. "Better in here," she said. "For now." Garrett slowed the horses to a walk. Sound carries in canyon country. If you're behind someone in a canyon and you push too hard, they hear you coming. She understood immediately. So they'll slow down too. Probably, unless they decide they don't care if we hear them. He scanned the canyon walls above them, not anxiously, but with the systematic attention of someone who had thought about this terrain before. "There's a branch point about a mile in. We take the left fork. It's narrower and it climbs steep, but it comes out on the upper plateau, and then we're in open country where I can see trouble coming." "And the right fork?" "Dead end, mostly." "Mostly?" "There's a way out at the far end, but it's a bad scramble and you'd have to leave the horses." He glanced at her. "It's not what I want." They moved through the canyon at a walk, which took discipline when every instinct said move faster. The canyon floor was uneven. Large, loose rocks mixed with sand and frozen patches where water had pooled and hardened. The horses picked through it carefully. The sound of their hooves was absorbed by the walls in a way that made the space feel both enclosed and vast at the same time. She was watching the walls. There was something about canyon country that always made her feel watched, and today that feeling was operational rather than imaginative. The walls were riddled with ledges and outcroppings, places where a person could sit and see everything below without being seen. She kept her eyes moving. Garrett stopped again. She came up beside him and saw immediately what he'd heard. The sound of hooves, somewhere behind them, not close, but inside the canyon. The riders hadn't slowed, or they had slowed and were still covering distance faster than she'd hoped. "They're in the canyon," she said. "Yes. They don't care if we hear them." "No," he said. "They don't." He started moving, faster now, the horse's walk becoming a trot, which was as fast as was safe on this floor. She pushed Clover to match. The branch point appeared around a bend in the canyon wall, a narrowing in the canyon floor where the left fork opened up as a much tighter passage, the walls almost close enough to touch on both sides, climbing steeply. The right fork continued broader and level. Garrett turned left without hesitation. The climb was immediate and serious, a rocky chute that the horses had to take carefully, one step at a time, their hindquarters dropping as they pushed upward. The gray gelding grunted but moved. Clover, with a sound that was unmistakably complaint, followed. The noise behind them got louder. Then a voice, from somewhere below in the main canyon, carrying up the chute with the terrible clarity that stone creates. "There, left fork!" She heard hooves change direction, faster now, no longer careful. "Go," Garrett said. She didn't need to be told twice. She leaned forward on Clover's neck and gave the mare her head, and they went up the chute the way scared animals go up things, with more speed than grace, hooves scrabbling, small rocks tumbling back down behind them. She could hear the riders below, heard the echo of their horses hitting the base of the chute, heard one of them shout something she couldn't make out. Then she was over the top of the chute and on a rocky shelf, and Garrett was already there, off his horse, pulling the gray to one side. "Off the horse," he said. "Quick." She was off before he finished saying it. He took Clover's reins and led both horses behind a large boulder at the edge of the shelf, out of sight of the chute's opening. Then he came back to the edge, flattening himself against the canyon wall, and she did the same on the other side, and they waited. The sounds from below were confused, voices, horses, the sharp echo of rocks struck hard.
One horse had clearly refused the chute. She could hear it. The particular sound of an animal deciding absolutely not, combined with the frustrated sounds of a rider who was not going to win that argument. Then one horse came up. It emerged from the chute at the far left edge of the shelf. A big bay, blowing hard, and on its back a man she didn't know, heavy built, with a rifle across his saddle bow. He pulled up immediately, looking for them. He didn't see them. He was looking out across the shelf toward the open country beyond, and they were pressed flat against the wall on either side of the chute opening, within 20 feet of him, and the boulder hid the horses, and he was looking in the wrong direction. Vivian stopped breathing. The man turned the bay in a slow circle, scanning. He was good, methodical, not panicked. I was looking for movement and not finding it because they weren't moving. Then, from below, the second rider. Anything? The man on the shelf took another long look around. His eyes passed across the boulder and continued, which was the longest 2 seconds of Vivian's recent life. Nothing, he called back down. They go across? The man looked at the open plateau beyond the shelf. He couldn't see tracks in the rock. He made a decision, which was the wrong one, and started across the shelf toward the plateau. Garrett moved. He stepped out from the wall while the man's back was turned, reached the horses in 3 steps, and had them moving before the man had gone 20 feet. He beckoned to Vivian without looking at her, and she crossed the open space between the wall and the boulder at what she hoped was a controlled walk and not the terrified scramble it felt like. Garrett handed her Clover's reins. Mount, he breathed. She mounted. He mounted the gray. The man on the bay had reached the far edge of the shelf and was looking out at the plateau, trying to find tracks on frozen ground. In 30 seconds, he would turn around. They went left, along the canyon wall, staying on rock, moving at a walk because a walk on rock is silent and a trot is not. There was a passage she hadn't seen from the chute opening, a narrow gap in the canyon wall that opened into a side draw, barely wide enough for a horse. Garrett turned into it and she followed, and they were in the draw and out of sight before the man on the bay turned around. From behind them, distant and confused, "Where in?" And then the wind took the rest of it. The draw climbed for 20 minutes and deposited them, breathing hard and scratched by the narrow walls, onto the backside of the ridge above Archer's Canyon. The plateau stretched north, and the snow was lighter up here, the clouds thinning slightly, a pale wash of sky showing through to the northwest. Garrett stopped and listened. Nothing below. No hooves, no voices. "They'll find the draw eventually," he said. "How long?" "Hard to say. The second horse refused the chute, so they've got one man up top and one man down. They'll need to regroup." He thought about it. 2 hours maybe, if they're smart. Are they smart? Smart enough to find our tracks in the snow, but not as smart as the canyon. He finally let out a long breath. "That was closer than I wanted." "You could have mentioned that it was going to be like that." "I didn't know it was going to be like that," he said, with enough of an edge that she could tell he was shaken too, which somehow made it easier. "I've never had someone actively following me through Archer's Canyon before. Generally, I'm out here alone. I'm sorry to have complicated your schedule." He looked at her sideways. "Are you actually apologizing to me right now?" "No," she said. "I'm using the form of apology to make a point. There's a difference." He stared at her for another second and shook his head and turned the gray north and started moving. She followed. They covered the plateau at a canter where the ground allowed it, eating distance between themselves and the canyon while they had the chance. The snow continued light and occasional. The pale sky held. She was grateful for both things, without trusting either of them. Garrett pulled back to a walk when they hit a section of broken ground where canter was unwise. "We need to talk about what happens when we get to Laramie," he said. "I know. You're planning to go to the federal marshal's office." "Yes." "Marshal in Laramie is a man named Cord Petty," Garrett said. "I've met him twice. He's not on Silas's payroll as far as I know, but I don't know his politics either. He's a careful man, official. He's not going to act on the ledger alone." "I know that too." "So what's the plan?" Vivian had been thinking about this through most of the ride, through the canyon, through the chute, through the 40 minutes since. Not the way you think when you're panicked, but the way you think when you've had a problem sitting in the back of your head long enough that it starts to organize itself whether you intend it to or not. "The ledger shows payments," she said, "but Elbert Fossey made those payments. Fossey's name is on the records as the deed clerk. If Fosse can be brought in and questioned under oath, the payments become a confession instead of just a record. Fosse's in Caldwell Creek. Yes. And Silas controls Caldwell Creek right now. But Fosse's not Silas. Fosse's a county clerk who took bribes. There's a difference between the man who built the machine and the man who oiled it. Fosse can be flipped. She paused. If there's enough pressure from a federal marshal, and if Fosse believes that Silas will sacrifice him to protect himself, which he will, because men like Silas always do, then Fosse talks. Garrett considered this. And the Telford letter? That's separate. That's a murder. That goes to the territorial court, not just the deed records. She shifted in the saddle. But I can't walk into a federal marshal's office with 2 documents and say, here, I need witnesses, people who lost land, people who can stand up in court and say what happened to them. Callum mentioned the Beckers in Rawlins. Rawlins is on the way to Laramie, she said. I want to stop. Garrett looked at her. That adds a day. I know. Those riders are a day behind us now, but I know, she said again. But if I walk into Laramie with the ledger alone, Silas's lawyers bury it in procedural challenges for a year. If I walk in with the ledger and 3 families who will testify, people who have names and faces, and children who used to go to school, it becomes much harder to bury. He was quiet for a moment, working through it. You've thought about this more than I realized, he said. I've had nothing else to do for the past 2 days, she said. Riding gives you time to think. Fair point. He looked north. Rawlins, then. I know someone there who can put us up safely. And if the Beckers are in the work camp Callum mentioned, I know where that is. Good. They rode in silence for a while. The plateau was starting to descend on the north side, the land tilting toward lower country, and she could see, or felt she could see, the distant suggestion of darker terrain that might be tree-line, which meant shelter and fuel and concealment. Vivian, Garrett said. She looked at him. What you did in that canyon, he said, standing flat against that wall, not moving, not making a sound. He kept his eyes forward. Most people panic. They can't hold still when they're scared. It's a physical thing. The body wants to run. I know, she said. I felt it. You didn't move. I've been standing still in front of rooms full of children who want to make noise for 3 years, she said. You learn to hold very still when stillness is what's required. He made that almost laugh sound, and this time it lasted longer. That is, he said, the most practical application of teaching experience I've ever heard of. I'm a practical person. I'm starting to understand that. They reached the tree line by mid-afternoon and stopped to rest the horses and eat something and take stock. The trees were lodgepole pine, dense enough to be a real shelter, and the snow that had been falling sporadically on the plateau was barely reaching the forest floor through the canopy. It was colder in the shade, but more protected, and the horses were showing the accumulated effect of 2 hard days. Not broken, but telling her clearly in the language of tired animals that they could use a rest. Garrett checked the gray's hooves while Vivian held Clover and gave her the last of May's apples. She favors her left front slightly, Garrett said about the gray. How slight? Slight enough that it's not a crisis, but enough that we rest him properly in Rawlins before we push again. He straightened. He picked up a small stone in the canyon. I got it out, but the hoof's a little tender. How far to Rawlins? Tomorrow midday, if we push. Tomorrow evening, if we're careful with him. She calculated. The riders were somewhere behind them, maybe more than one set by now because Silas had the resources to send multiple groups once he understood the direction. 2 days to Rawlins and then a day on to Laramie, possibly 2. The Wednesday deadline was already passed. It was Thursday, she realized, which meant Silas had either already moved on her belongings and her position or was in the process of doing so. She thought about the schoolhouse, about her books, her teaching materials, the children's drawings she'd had pinned on the wall. She thought about Carl Bauer's cattle drawing. She'd packed it. It was in the satchel, folded flat inside the front cover of the ledger. If he knows I'm heading for Laramie, she said, he might try to get there ahead of us. He'll try to intercept us before we get there, Garrett said. That's what I'd do. The riders behind us aren't going to let us walk into a federal marshal's office. They'll push to catch us before that. How far ahead do you think we are? Right now? Hard to say. They lost time in the canyon. If they regrouped fast and found the draw... He paused. Maybe 4 hours. Maybe more. 4 hours isn't much. No, he agreed. It's not. He put a hand on the gray's neck. We keep moving. Slower through the trees, but we keep moving. She nodded. Then, from somewhere behind them, far enough to be non-immediate, close enough to be real, came the sound of a shot. One shot, flat and hard and absorbed almost immediately by the trees. They both froze. Signal shot, Garrett said after a moment. They're calling to each other, coordinating. There are more of them. Sounds like it. His voice was steady, which took effort, she could tell. They've split up and they're signaling position. She thought about what that meant. Multiple groups, coordinating, which meant someone was directing them, someone who knew the territory well enough to split riders into coordinating teams. Not just hired men following a trail, something more organized than that. Silas is here, she said, not in Caldwell Creek. He's out here directing this himself. Garrett looked at her. He doesn't trust hired men to handle this, she said. The ledger isn't just evidence of fraud. It's evidence of Telford's murder. That's not a thing he delegates. She felt the weight of that settle on her. He's here personally. Garrett was quiet for a moment. That changes things. How? Silas Hargrove in a room with judges and lawyers is one kind of dangerous, Garrett said. Silas Hargrove in the mountains with men who work for him directly is a different kind. She understood. The law was one thing. This, out here in the open country, 4 hours behind them, was something more immediate. We need to move, she said. We need to think first. While moving, he almost disagreed and then didn't. They mounted and moved north through the trees, and Garrett talked while they rode. There's a ridge between here and Rawlins where the trail narrows to a single track for about 3 miles, he said. It's the most exposed section on the route. If Silas knows the territory, and if he's from here, he might. He'll try to get men in front of us and bottle us on that ridge. How would he get men in front of us? He's behind us. The main road to Rawlins runs around the south end of the mountain. Fast riders on the main road could get ahead of us if they left right now. He thought about it, working through the geography. If Silas split his group, some behind us, some on the main road to cut around, then we arrive at the ridge and there are riders waiting. It's what I'd do, he said again. She thought about it. The satchel was on her shoulder, the ledger solid against her ribs, and she thought about Silas's patient face in the schoolhouse and the way he'd held her wrist without squeezing, because he hadn't needed to squeeze. Is there another way around the ridge? She asked. Yes and no. Garrett ducked a low branch, straightened. There's a way through the ridge rather than over it. An old mine cut. Not active, hasn't been for 15 years. Goes straight through the base of the ridge. It's dark, and the footing's bad, and you have to lead the horses on foot because the ceiling's too low to ride. But they wouldn't expect it. Nobody uses it. Most people don't know it's there. He paused. I know it's there because my father used to store equipment in it during the summer. She didn't hesitate. Then that's the way we go. It's not a good option, Vivian. It's just a less bad one. I'm starting to think less bad is what we're working with. He gave her a look that was something between rueful and approving, and turned north-northwest off the trail they'd been following into denser trees. The mine cut was exactly as he'd described it, a horizontal shaft driven into the base of the ridge at some point in the past by men who had hoped for silver and found insufficient quantities to justify continuing. The entrance was partially grown over with brush that Garrett pushed aside with his arms, and inside was the particular darkness of enclosed underground spaces, total, flat, with a smell of old stone and dampness that had no weather in it. Vivian stood at the entrance and looked in. How long? She said. 1/4 mile, maybe. 20 minutes on foot leading the horses. She looked at the horses. Clover was already expressing opinions about the smell coming from the opening. The gray was more stoic. I'll go first, Garrett said. The gray will follow me. Clover will follow the gray. Clover will need convincing. I know. He looked at the mare. You want to handle her, or do you want me to? I'll handle her. She's mine. He took a lamp from his saddlebag, a small one with a wind hood, and got it lit and went in, the gray following on the lead rope with the resigned air of an animal that had done stranger things. Vivian took Clover's bridle and said, very close to the mare's ear, I know, I agree with you, but we're going anyway, and pulled, and after a moment of very clear protest, Clover went. Inside, the lamp threw a small globe of yellow light that made the darkness beyond it seem thicker by contrast. The ceiling was roughly 8 feet, high enough to walk upright, not high enough to ride. The floor was uneven but passable. The walls were close. She could have put both arms out and nearly touched both sides. She focused on the lamplight ahead of her and kept moving. The horse's hooves on the stone floor were loud enough that she understood immediately why this was not a route if you cared about being heard. Every footfall echoed, stacked on itself, built into something larger. She counted her own steps to give her mind something to do, instead of thinking about the weight of the rock above her, which she was actively choosing not to think about. Garrett kept moving at a steady pace. He didn't look back to check on her, which was, she decided, trust rather than indifference, because if he'd checked on her, he would have seen that she was managing, and he already seemed to know she would be. The satchel was against her chest, her arm over it. At some point in the middle of the tunnel, with nothing to see but the lamp ahead, and nothing behind her but dark, she thought about Silas on that ridge, waiting, patient, the way he was always patient. She thought about all the families whose land he had taken with that same patience, not in a single dramatic act, but over years, document by document, payment by payment, one deed at a time. She thought, he has had 4 years of patience. I have 3 days. She kept walking. The tunnel curved slightly right, and then the darkness ahead of the lamp changed quality, became less absolute, took on the dull gray of daylight filtering from a long way off. She could feel the grade lifting slightly underfoot. "Almost there," Garrett said, and his voice was different inside the tunnel, compressed, immediate. The exit came up as a narrowing, then a curtain of dead brush and tangled root from the ridge above, and then they pushed through it and the cold air hit like a hand flat on the face, and they were out, north side of the ridge. Open country ahead, rolling, treeless, declining toward the lower ground where Rollins sat somewhere beyond the next range of hills. The sky here was clear, impossibly clear after the tunnel and the forest, and the late afternoon sun was out and low and made every piece of frost on the ground shine individually. Garrett stopped and turned. She came out behind him with Clover, and both horses stood blinking in the sudden light with the expressions of animals reconsidering their life choices. "We're on the north side," she said. "Yes." He was looking around, scanning the ridgeline above, the country to either side. "If Silas put men on the trail over the ridge, they're up there." He pointed at the ridge crest. "Not down here. They don't know about the tunnel. Very few people do." He looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes?" She paused. "Actually, yes, not just saying it." "Good." He took the gray's reins and started north. "Let's get off the ridgeline before the light goes." She fell in beside him, and they moved north through the clear, cold afternoon, and behind them the ridge stood solid and silent, and on top of it, she would learn later, 3 of Silas's riders sat their horses on the trail and waited for people who were already on the other side. But she didn't know that yet. What she knew, as the ridge fell behind them and the lower country opened up ahead, was that she was still moving and the satchel was still on her shoulder and the ledger was still against her ribs, and that they had made it through one more thing that was supposed to stop them and hadn't quite managed it. The town of Rollins was out there, a day away. And somewhere in a work camp outside Rollins, a woman named Mrs. Becker was living in whatever was left of her life after Silas Hargrove had finished with it, and she didn't know yet that someone was coming to find her. Vivian adjusted the satchel strap and kept walking. They reached the outskirts of Rollins the following evening. Not midday, as Garrett had first calculated, because the gray gelding's tender hoof had slowed them through the morning, and they'd made a long detour around a stretch of open ground where 2 riders, distant but present, had been visible on the southern horizon. Whether those were Silas's men or simply ranchers going about their business, neither of them could say, and the cost of being wrong was too high to find out. So they went around, which added 3 hours, and arrived in Rollins in the thin blue light of early evening with tired horses and 4 days of mountain travel on them. Rollins was not a large town, but it was a real one, a railroad town that had grown around the Union Pacific line and had the particular energy of places where commerce moved through rather than settled. There were hotels and a telegraph office and 3 saloons and a mercantile that was still lit from inside when they came down the main street. There were people on the sidewalks, which was both comfort and complication. Garrett led them off the main street after one block and through a series of back lanes that suggested he knew the town better than she'd expected. "You said you knew someone here," she said. "A woman named Iris Calhoun. She runs a boarding house on the east side. She's been in Rawlins 15 years and she knows where everybody is buried, figuratively speaking." He paused. "She and my mother were close. After my mother died, Iris used to send food out to the ranch on the holidays whether we wanted it or not. Is she someone we can trust?" "She's someone who once hid a Chinese railroad worker from a mob for 3 days under her kitchen floor," Garrett said. "Yes, she's someone we can trust." The boarding house was a wide, 2-story structure with a lamp burning in the front window and a smell of something cooking that reached them from the street. Garrett knocked rather than walking in, which Vivian noted. The particular courtesy of a man who understood that a woman's home is her home, regardless of whether it's also a business. The door was opened by a woman of perhaps 65, broad-shouldered, with gray hair pinned back with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped caring about appearance and started caring about function some decades ago. She looked at Garrett, then at Vivian, then at the horses. "You look terrible," she said to Garrett. "Good evening, Iris." "Both of you. Inside." She stepped back from the door. "The horses go around back. There's a young man named Pete who'll see to them. Don't argue with him about it. He knows what he's doing." They were inside within the hour, horses seen to, boots off, seated at Iris Calhoun's kitchen table with bowls of something that turned out to be beef stew with more substance to it than anything Vivian had eaten in 4 days. Iris sat across from them with a cup of coffee and listened to a compressed version of events. Garrett told it, mostly, with Vivian correcting 3 details he'd gotten slightly wrong, and Iris listened the way experienced people listen to complicated situations, without interrupting, without reacting visibly, processing. When Garrett finished, Iris was quiet for a moment. "Silas Hargrove," she said. "I know that name. He's been buying land in Carbon County, too. Smaller operations than what you're describing, but the pattern is the same." She looked at Vivian. "You have the ledger with you now?" "Yes. And you're planning to take it to Cord Petty at the federal marshal's office in Laramie?" "Yes. But I need witnesses first. Families who lost their land and will testify. I was told there might be a family named Becker at the work camp east of town." Iris set her coffee cup down. "I know the Beckers," she said. Vivian looked at her. "Clara Becker brought her 3 children into town about 6 weeks ago. Her husband died, officially a fever, but Clara told me he'd been in a dispute with a land agent in the weeks before he got sick, and she doesn't believe the fever story." Iris's voice was even, factual. "She's working at the laundry on Railroad Street. The children are with her. They're managing." "Will she talk to me?" Iris considered. Clara Becker is a woman who has been through the fire and come out the other side still standing, but she's also a woman who is very carefully keeping her head down because she's got 3 children and nothing else. She's not going to take risks without a reason. "I have a reason," Vivian said. "I have 17 names in a ledger and a letter that describes what was done to her husband." Iris looked at her steadily. "Then you should tell her that yourself." She stood collecting bowls. "In the morning. Let her sleep tonight. She works a 14-hour day." Vivian started to say that morning might be too late, that Silas's riders were behind them, that time was the thing they had least of. She started to say it, and then she stopped, because she looked at Iris Calhoun's expression and saw in it the particular patience of someone who had seen urgency make things worse and understood that a frightened woman with 3 children needed to be approached properly, not rushed. "In the morning," Vivian said. Iris nodded. "There's a room upstairs. 1 room. You'll have to sort that out between yourselves." She looked at both of them without any particular judgment. "There's a bolt on the door and fresh water in the pitcher." Garrett, who had been looking at the table throughout this, said, "I'll take the chair." "You'll take the cot in the hall," Iris said. "I keep one for overflow." She left them with the lamp and went upstairs. Garrett and Vivian sat at the cleared table for a moment in the quiet kitchen. "The Beckers were there," Vivian said. "Yes." "And Clara thinks her husband was killed." "Yes." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That matches the Telford letter, the usual way. If Silas has been doing it consistently, it's not just fraud," Vivian said. "It never was. I knew that when I found the letter. But hearing it from someone who lived it..." She stopped. "We need to be careful tomorrow, not just with Silas's riders, with Clara." "How do you mean?" I mean that she's going to look at me and see someone asking her to carry something very heavy when she's already carrying everything she can. I need to make sure she understands what she's being asked and what she stands to get back." She paused. "And I need to be honest with her about the risk. I'm not going to lie to her to get what I need." Garrett looked at her across the table. "I didn't think you would. Some people would in this situation." "I know." He kept looking at her. "But you won't." It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was just a statement of what he'd observed, said without ornamentation. She found, as she had found with several things he said, that it landed more solidly than an ornamental compliment would have. "Get some sleep," she said. "You too." She went upstairs. She bolted the door and put the satchel under the pillow and lay down on the bed and was asleep almost before she'd finished lying down. Railroad Street in the morning was loud with the particular industry of a town built around freight, wagons, men shouting inventory numbers, the distant percussion of the rail yard. The laundry where Clara Becker worked was a long, low building that exhaled steam from 2 vents at the roofline and could be smelled from half a block away, hot water and lye soap and the particular exhausted smell of large quantities of linen. Garrett stayed with the horses. Vivian went in alone. The inside of the laundry was hot and loud, the sound of water and the heavy slap of wet fabric and women working in rows along long wooden tables and over large steaming vats. She asked for Clara Becker at the front and was directed to the far end of the room, and she walked the length of it past women who didn't look up because looking up was a luxury you couldn't afford when you were being paid by the load. Clara Becker was at the far end, feeding sheets through a mangle press. She was younger than Vivian had expected, perhaps 30, perhaps less, with the kind of face that would have been pretty in easier circumstances and was still striking even when drawn tight with exhaustion. She had dark circles under her eyes, and her hair was pulled back with a strip of cloth, and her hands on the mangle were red and slightly raw. She looked up when Vivian stopped in front of her. "Mrs. Becker?" "Who's asking?" "Not unfriendly, just careful." "My name is Vivian Ashcroft. I was a teacher in Caldwell Creek. I knew Ruth before—" She paused. "Before everything." Something moved in Clara Becker's face, complicated, quick. "Ruth talked about her teacher," she said. "Miss Ashcroft. She liked you." "Ruth was wonderful. I still have a drawing she did." Clara's hands had stopped on the mangle. She was looking at Vivian the way people look when they're trying to assess something quickly and don't have much margin for error. "What do you want?" Vivian looked around. The nearest woman was 6 feet away and busy with her own work, and the noise of the room was covering conversation. But still. "Is there somewhere we can talk?" she said. "I've got a 15-minute break at 10. You can wait." Clara looked at her steadily. "Or you can say whatever you came to say right here, because I'm not taking time off the line for something I haven't heard yet." "Fair." Vivian respected it. "I have a ledger," she said, keeping her voice low. "It shows the payments that were made to the clerk who transferred your family's deed. It shows 17 families, the amounts paid, and when. I also have a letter that refers to what I believe happened to your husband." She held Clara's gaze. "I'm taking it to the federal marshal in Laramie. I need people who will testify to what happened to them, and I need to know if you'll consider it." Clara's face had gone very still. "Where did you get a ledger like that?" she said. "County Records Office in Caldwell Creek. And the man whose name is on those payments, does he know you have it?" "He knows I took documents from the office. He sent riders after me. We came through the mountains to avoid them." She paused. "They're still coming. I need to be in Laramie in 2 days." Clara turned back to the mangle. Her hands moved again, methodical. She fed the sheet through and caught it on the other side and folded it with practiced efficiency, and then set it down and turned back. "My husband was a healthy man," she said. 34 years old. He'd never had a serious sickness in his life. Her voice was flat, the flatness of someone who has said this to themselves so many times that the saying has worn a groove. He had a meeting with a land agent 6 weeks before he died. He came home from that meeting very quiet, and he wouldn't tell me everything that was said. 3 weeks later, he got a fever. 2 weeks after that, he was dead. "I'm sorry," Vivian said. "The letter," Clara said. "You said you have a letter that refers to what happened. It refers to a man being handled, in the usual way, written by the man who runs the land company."
Silas Hargrove. The name in Clara's mouth was different from the name in anyone else's mouth. It had a specific weight to it, the weight of someone who had lived the consequence of that name. Yes, Vivian said. Clara looked at her for a long moment. If I testify, she said, and if it doesn't work, if his lawyers find a way to make it go away, what happens to my children? Vivian didn't say it will work. She didn't say I promise. She said, if it doesn't work, you're no worse off than you are now, because right now there's no record of what happened and no one looking at it. If it works, you get justice for your husband and possibly the land back, or compensation for it. She paused. I won't lie to you about the risk. There is risk. But there's also risk in doing nothing, because Silas Hargrove is still operating and there are more families after yours. Clara folded her hands in front of her. They were the hands of a woman who had worked very hard for a long time, and there was something in looking at them that made Vivian's chest tight. Where are you going in Laramie? Clara said. Federal Marshal's office, Cord Petty. When do you leave? Tomorrow morning, early. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, my children need 2 days' notice for the family I board them with when I travel. I can't give them that. She said it the way you say a logistical fact rather than a refusal. But I can write a statement, everything I know, everything I remember, written and signed. Will that help? Enormously, Vivian said. And if the marshal wants me there in person? Then I'll come back for you, or send someone. She met Clara's eyes. I'm not going to use you and disappear. Something in Clara's expression shifted, very slightly, the way a tight knot loosens one thread at a time. All right, she said. Come back at noon. I'll have something written. Vivian thanked her and turned to leave, and then Clara said, Miss Ashcroft. She turned back. Ruth learned more in your class than she'd learned in the 2 years before it, Clara said. I want you to know that. Vivian held that for a moment. Tell her I still have the drawing, she said, when you see her. She walked back through the length of the laundry and out into the street. Oh, Garrett was waiting 2 blocks away with the horses, in the alley beside a feed merchant. He looked at her face when she came around the corner and said, Well? She'll give us a written statement, signed, and she believes her husband was murdered. He absorbed this. That's a start. It's more than a start. It's a surviving family member willing to put her name on a document in connection with Silas Hargrove. She took a breath. We need to find out if any of the other families from the ledger are within reach of Rollins. Are there other families you know of who lost land in this county, Carbon County, the areas Iris mentioned? There's a man named Dolan who ranched northwest of here. He lost his place about 2 years ago. I heard it mentioned at a cattle sale. Don't know where he ended up. Iris might know. They went back to the boarding house. Iris did know. She knew that a Frank Dolan and his adult son were working at the rail yards, had been for 18 months, and that Frank Dolan had never stopped being angry about what happened to his land, which Iris considered both a character flaw and, under the current circumstances, a potential asset. He'll talk, Iris said. The question is whether you can get him to stop. Garrett went to the rail yards. Vivian stayed at the boarding house and did something she'd been meaning to do since the canyon. She sat down at Iris's kitchen table with a sheet of paper and wrote out, from memory, the full contents of the ledger. Every name, every date, every payment amount, every transferred deed. She did it because the ledger was one document in one satchel, and one document in one satchel could be lost or destroyed or taken, and a teacher's memory was a different kind of storage entirely. She wrote for 2 hours. Her hand cramped and she straightened it and kept writing. When she finished, she had 6 sheets of paper dense with figures and names, and she folded them and wrapped them in oilcloth and gave them to Iris. If something happens to me before Laramie, she said. Iris took them without ceremony. Nothing's going to happen to you, she said, and then, because she was an honest woman, but all right. Garrett came back at 11 with Frank Dolan in tow. Frank Dolan was 50 or thereabouts, a big man with a face that had weathered into something that looked more like a landscape than a person, and the compressed energy of someone who had been angry for a long time and had run out of ways to express it. He sat down at Iris's table, looked at Vivian, looked at the satchel, and said, You've got proof. Yes. Of what exactly? Payments to the deed clerk for your land transfer, dated, recorded, in Silas Hargrove's own ledger. Frank Dolan put both hands flat on the table and pressed them down slowly, as though he were trying to keep himself in the chair.
I knew it, he said. I knew that deed transfer was wrong. My lawyer said I couldn't prove it. I spent 8 months trying to find the proof, and I couldn't. He looked at Vivian. You just walked into the county office and found it? I was looking for something else, she said. I found this instead. And you just took it. I took it. He stared at her for a moment. Then he looked at Garrett. She always like this? Pretty much, Garrett said. Frank Dolan turned back to Vivian. What do you need from me? A written statement of what happened to your land, dates, amounts, the name of the agent who approached you, everything you remember. And if the marshal wants you in Laramie, a willingness to go. I'll go to Laramie tomorrow if you want, he said. I'll go right now. Tomorrow morning, Vivian said. We leave at first light. She went to the laundry at noon and collected Clara Becker's statement. 5 pages in a careful, deliberate hand, everything dated and specific. Vivian read it standing in the alley outside, and by the 3rd page her jaw was tight with something she was choosing not to call rage, because rage wasn't useful yet. She folded the pages into the satchel, alongside the ledger, alongside the Telford letter, alongside Carl Bauer's cattle drawing, and she closed the buckle and went back to Iris's. The problem arrived at 3 in the afternoon. Iris came into the kitchen where Vivian and Garrett were going over the route to Laramie and said, without preamble, there are 2 men asking at the hotel about a woman and a man traveling together. The woman matches your description. Vivian and Garrett looked at each other. How close? Garrett said. Main Street, 20 minutes ago. Iris sat down. They didn't push, just asked politely if anyone had seen you. The hotel clerk told them no because the hotel clerk knows me, and I know the hotel clerk, and I told him this morning that if anyone came asking about strangers to send word. Silas got men here ahead of us, Garrett said. The long way around. Main road. They've been waiting, Vivian said. They knew we'd need to resupply somewhere. Rollins is the only town on this route big enough to matter. He leaned back. They're not sure we're here yet, or they'd have been more aggressive. They're fishing. How long before they're sure, she said. Once they've hit every hotel and boarding house in town? A few hours? He looked at Iris. How many places are there? 6 boarding houses, 2 hotels. Iris's expression was calm in the way of someone who does not panic because panic is inefficient. You're at the East End. They started at the Main Street. You have time. Do we leave tonight? Vivian said. Garrett thought about it. The gray gelding's hoof needed rest. They'd planned to leave at first light, which was 7 hours away. Frank Dolan was coming tomorrow, and Clara Becker's statement was already in the satchel, but Dolan's wasn't yet written, and she wanted his signed statement, and she wanted him in Laramie if at all possible. I'll go to Dolan now, he said. Get the statement written and signed tonight. We leave before dawn. 4 in the morning, Vivian said. Earlier if needed. I'll have food ready, Iris said, and stood, which was her way of closing discussions. Garrett left for the rail yards. Vivian sat with the satchel in her lap and listened to Iris moving around the kitchen and thought about the 2 men on the main street working their way east through the boarding houses. Polite, systematic, patient, just like their employer. At some point during the wait, she took out Carl Bauer's drawing and unfolded it and looked at it. 9 years old, cattle in a field, drawn in pencil on the back of a spelling test. The cattle were not technically accurate, but they were recognizably cattle and recognizably loved. You could tell from the care taken with each one, the way a child draws things that matter to them. She had graded the spelling test on the front. Carl had gotten 7 out of 10. She folded it back and put it away. Garrett came back at 6 with Frank Dolan's statement, 4 pages, less elegant than Clara's but more detailed in certain ways, including the name of the specific land agent who'd first approached him and the sequence of events that had followed. The agent's name was not in the ledger by itself, but it connected to a company name that was, which was the kind of thread that could be followed. He wants to come tonight, Garrett said. Dolan. He says he's been waiting 2 years for this, and he's not waiting one more night. It's safer if he comes separately, Vivian said. If we're stopped, we don't want him caught with us. That's what I told him. He didn't like it. He doesn't have to like it. She looked at Garrett. Tell him to take the main road to Laramie. It's longer and more exposed, but he's a single traveler on legitimate business, and nobody's looking for him. Tell him to go to the federal marshal's office and ask for Cord Petty, and give his name and say that Vivian Ashcroft sent him, and that he has a statement regarding Silas Hargrove's land operations. Garrett looked at her. You've thought about this. I've been sitting here for 3 hours. He went back to the rail yards. Iris fed her supper and then sat across from her and said, What happens if the marshal doesn't move on it? Then I find a territorial judge who will, Vivian said. And if the judge is in Silas's pocket, then I find a newspaper. She held Iris's gaze. There's a territorial paper in Cheyenne that's been writing about land fraud for 2 years. I know that because I read every paper I could get my hands on in Caldwell Creek, and I remembered it. She paused. Silas is powerful inside his network, but his network has edges, and at the edges what he's done looks like exactly what it is. Iris was quiet for a moment. Your mother raised a particular kind of woman, she said finally. My father, actually. Then your father did. She stood. Sleep a few hours. I'll wake you at 3. Vivian went upstairs. The satchel was on the bed beside her, and she lay on top of the covers and looked at the ceiling. Through the wall, she could hear Garrett on the cot in the hall. Not sound exactly, but the sense of him there, the slight change in a space when it is occupied by someone. She thought about Clara Becker's hands on the mangle. She thought about Frank Dolan pressing his palms flat on the table, like a man trying to stay in his chair. She thought about the Crow family and their 30 years on their land and what 30 years of work looks like when someone signs a document and erases it. She thought about Silas Hargrove's patient face. She closed her eyes. Iris woke her at 3 as promised. Garrett was already up, already had the horses from Pete, already had both sets of saddlebags packed with what Iris had put together. Food, a spare lamp, a blanket each. The gray gelding seemed better for the night's rest, picking his feet up cleanly, which was a relief. The town was completely silent. Not even the rail yards were active at this hour. They went out through the back of the boarding house and through the alley and north, staying off the main street, moving through the sleeping town by back lanes that Iris had described to Garrett from memory and that he navigated without hesitation. At the north edge of town, where the road opened up into the flat, open country that ran toward Laramie, Vivian looked back once. Iris Calhoun's boarding house was invisible in the dark, but somewhere in it a woman of 65 had gone back to bed after waking early to see them off. And in the kitchen were 6 sheets of oilcloth-wrapped paper with the contents of the ledger in Vivian's handwriting, because one copy was never enough. She turned north and didn't look back again. The road to Laramie was the main road, wide, established, used by freight wagons and ranch vehicles and the ordinary commerce of the territory. It was not the route Garrett would have chosen for concealment, but the gray's hoof and the remaining distance, and the fact that Silas's men were presumably watching the backcountry routes, made the main road the least bad option. They rode hard for 2 hours before anyone spoke. How do you want to handle Petty? Garrett said. Directly. She shifted the satchel. I'm not going to try to manage it. I'm going to put the ledger on his desk, put the Telford letter next to it, put Clara Becker's statement and Frank Dolan's statement beside that, and tell him everything from the beginning. And if he says he needs time to verify, then I ask how much time and I ask what he needs to verify it, and I get it for him. She kept her eyes on the road. I'm not going to be the woman who storms into a lawman's office and demands action and makes him feel pushed into a corner. I know what that gets you. What does it get you? Nothing. Men in official positions who feel pushed into corners dig in. Petty needs to believe he's acting on the strength of the evidence, not under pressure from a school teacher. She paused. Which means I present the evidence clearly and completely and let him reach the conclusion himself. And if his conclusion is the wrong one, then I find out why and I address it. She paused again. One thing at a time. They rode. Dawn came up slowly behind them, the sky going from black to deep blue to a cold gray that eventually admitted a strip of pale orange along the eastern horizon. The road was empty this early, nothing moving in either direction, and for a stretch of perhaps an hour she felt something she hadn't felt since Monday afternoon in the schoolhouse. Not safety, but the absence of immediate threat, which was close enough. Garrett, she said. Yeah. Thank you. He was quiet for a moment. You already said that. I know. I meant it differently this time. She looked at the road. At the beginning you said you were helping because I looked you in the eye and because I shouldn't be out here alone. That's a practical reason. I appreciate practical reasons. She paused. But somewhere between the canyon and Rollins, it stopped being just practical for you. I noticed that.
A pause.
Did you? He said. I'm observant. It's the other thing teaching gives you. He turned the gray slightly to avoid a rut in the road. I don't know exactly when it changed, he said. Somewhere in that tunnel, maybe. He thought about it. Or maybe in the ruins when the owl scared us both half to death, and you didn't say a word about it the next morning. Mentioning it wouldn't have helped. That's sort of my point. He glanced at her sideways. You don't waste energy on things that don't help. He considered the word. It's a particular kind of steadiness. I respect it. She looked at him. I notice things too, he said, without elaborating. The road stretched north. Laramie was somewhere ahead in the brightening morning, and the satchel was on her shoulder, and Frank Dolan was presumably on this same road ahead of them somewhere, and the Ledger had made it through the canyon and the mountain tunnel in 4 days of hard travel, and Vivian Ashcroft was still moving toward the thing she'd decided to do when she'd walked out of Caldwell Creek with nothing but evidence and direction. She wasn't safe yet. She wasn't done yet. But the road was clear and the morning was coming, and she was not walking it alone. They rode into Laramie at mid-morning. The town was larger than Rawlins, a proper territorial city with a courthouse and a land office and a federal building that sat at the north end of the main street with a flag above it that snapped in the wind. There were freight wagons on the street and men conducting business on the sidewalks, and the general noise of a place where the machinery of the territory ran. Vivian saw none of it particularly. She was watching for riders. There were none that she could identify as Silas's. No one who slowed when they passed. No one positioned at intersections in the way men position themselves when they're waiting rather than going somewhere. Either they'd arrived ahead of whatever net Silas had tried to set, or Silas's reach into Laramie was less than his reach everywhere else. She didn't trust either possibility enough to relax. Frank Dolan, Garrett said quietly. She followed his eyes. Across the street, in front of a dry goods store, Frank Dolan was standing with a cup of coffee, looking at them with the expression of a man who has been waiting and is relieved but also still angry, which was his consistent mode of being. He raised the cup slightly. He made it, she said. Main roads faster. He was probably here before midnight. She nodded. Tell him to meet us at the marshal's office in 1 hour. I want to go in first, alone. Garrett looked at her. Petty needs to hear it in order, she said. 3 people walking in together looks like a mob. 1 person with documents looks like evidence. She held his gaze. 1 hour. He went across to Dolan. Vivian tied Clover at the post outside a water trough and checked the satchel's buckle for the 4th time since dawn, a habit she'd developed over 5 days that she was aware was not entirely rational and did not intend to stop. She took a breath. Then she walked to the federal building. The marshal's office was on the ground floor, left side of the building, a door with a frosted glass panel that said U.S. Marshal, Albany County, in black letters. She knocked and went in without waiting for an answer, which was either confidence or the fact that she was past the point where waiting politely felt like the right priority. The office was functional and not particularly clean. A large desk, 2 filing cabinets, a territorial map pinned to the wall with pins in it that she automatically began reading before she caught herself. A deputy at a side desk looked up. He was young, with the specific wariness of young law officers who have learned that people who walk in without knocking usually want something complicated. Help you? I need to see Marshal Petty. My name is Vivian Ashcroft. I've come from Caldwell Creek with evidence of land fraud and at least 1 murder connected to the operations of a man named Silas Hargrove. I've been traveling for 5 days through the backcountry to get here, and I'd like to see him now if possible. The deputy looked at her for a moment. She looked back at him steadily. He stood up and went through the inner door. She waited. The inner door opened again, and a man came out who was not what she'd expected. Cord Petty was perhaps 50, slight, with a precisely trimmed beard and the eyes of someone who read documents for a living, careful, habitual, looking for the thing that didn't line up. He looked at her the way he probably looked at everything, assessing without yet concluding. Miss Ashcroft, he said, Marshal Petty. Come in. He held the inner door. Wilkins, hold anything that isn't on fire.
This was tidier than the outer one. A man, she thought, who controlled his own space more than his staff's. He sat behind his desk and she sat across from it, and she put the satchel on the desk between them and opened it.
I'm going to tell you everything, she said, from the beginning, and then I'm going to show you the documents and let you read them yourself. I'd ask that you not interrupt until I've finished telling it, and then you can ask me anything you want. Petty folded his hands on the desk. All right, he said. She told it. She told it the way she'd been constructing it in her head since Rollins. In order, specific, no embellishment and no softening. The county records office, the ledger, the payment records matching the 17 families. The Telford letter. Silas in her schoolroom. The sheriff who'd done nothing. 5 days through the back country with riders behind them. Archer's Canyon. The mine cut. Rollins and Clara Becker and Frank Dolan. She talked for 22 minutes. She knew it was 22 minutes because there was a clock on Petty's wall, and she watched it without meaning to, aware of every minute that was not yet resolution. When she finished, Petty unfolded his hands and held one out across the desk. She put the ledger in it. He read it the way she'd read it, carefully, going back twice. He turned pages and went back. He set it down, and she put the Telford letter in front of him, and he read that too. And his expression didn't change much, but something in his posture did. A slight forward lean, almost imperceptible. He set the letter down. Clara Becker's statement, she said, and put it in front of him. Then Dolan's. He read both. Then he sat back. Elbert Fossey, he said. He's the deed clerk in Caldwell Creek. His name is on the payment records as the recipient. I know who Fossey is? Petty's voice was even. He was questioned 2 years ago in connection with a separate deed irregularity in Carbon County. Charges didn't stick. He looked at the ledger. This is physical documentation of payments to a county clerk for the fraudulent transfer of private land. That's a federal crime when it involves the suppression of homestead rights. He looked at her. You understand that taking these documents from the county records office was itself legally questionable. I understand that, she said. I also understand that if I'd left them there, they would have been destroyed within 48 hours of my leaving the office. The deed clerk who received those payments had every incentive to eliminate records once he knew they'd been found. She held Petty's gaze. I'd rather have an awkward conversation about chain of evidence than no evidence at all. Petty was quiet for a moment. She couldn't entirely read him, which was disconcerting after 5 days of reading people. He was more controlled than most. The Telford death, he said. The letter refers to handling him in the usual way. You're asserting this means he was killed. I'm asserting that a healthy 34-year-old man who had recently disputed a land transfer died of a sudden fever 6 weeks after that dispute, that his widow believes he was killed, and that the language of the letter, handled in the usual way, implies a pattern rather than a singular event, which means there may be other deaths attributed to illness or accident that warrant examination. That's a significant assertion. I know, I'm making it anyway. She didn't back up. The ledger is enough to open a fraud investigation. The Telford letter is enough to open a murder inquiry. I'm not asking you to convict him today. I'm asking you to look at what I've brought you and open the door. Petty looked at her for a long moment. It was the kind of look that was not unfriendly but was definitely evaluating, and she sat through it without fidgeting because she'd been sitting through evaluating looks from the front of a classroom for 3 years and had gotten good at it. You have 2 witnesses outside, he said. Waiting down the street. Frank Dolan and Garrett Boone. Dolan lost his land to the same operation 2 years ago. Boone has a ranch that received a purchase inquiry from Silas's holding company and later experienced property damage he believes was coercive. I'll want to speak to both of them. They're available whenever you want. Petty stood. He picked up the ledger and the Telford letter, crossed to his filing cabinet, and locked them inside with a key from his vest pocket. Then he turned back to her. I'm going to be direct with you, Miss Ashcroft, he said. Silas Hargrove has operated in this territory for 30 years. He has lawyers in Cheyenne and connections in the territorial government that I would be naive to ignore. This is not going to be fast, and it is not going to be clean, and there will be a period during which the outcome is genuinely uncertain. He paused. What I can tell you is that what you've brought me is sufficient to open a formal federal investigation, which means Silas Hargrove cannot legally transfer or encumber any of the disputed properties while the investigation is pending. It means Elbert Fossey can be subpoenaed and compelled to testify. And it means the Telford death can be officially reopened. She felt something happen in her chest, a release of something that had been held tight for 5 days. Not victory. Not yet. but the door opening, which was what she'd asked for. "There's one more thing," she said. She reached into the satchel and took out the 6 sheets of oilcloth-wrapped paper, the ledger contents she'd written from memory in Iris Calhoun's kitchen. "This is a complete transcription of the ledger, written from memory. It's in Iris Calhoun's keeping in Rawlins. She's a reliable witness to its provenance. I'm giving you this copy now. A 3rd copy will be prepared and lodged with a newspaper in Cheyenne within the week." Petty looked at the papers. Then he looked at her. "You made 3 copies of a 500-item ledger from memory." "I've had a lot of practice memorizing things," she said. "It's what teachers do." He almost smiled. It was very brief and very controlled, but it was there. "I'll need you available for the next several days," he said. "There will be questions and likely a formal deposition." "I'm not going anywhere." He picked up the papers. "The witnesses. Send them in." The next several days were not clean, as Cord Petty had promised. There was a period on the 2nd day when a lawyer appeared at the marshal's office, a man from Cheyenne named Aldous Webb, well-dressed, deliberate, who presented documents arguing that the ledger had been illegally obtained and should be excluded. Petty listened to Webb for 40 minutes and then told him that the admissibility question would be determined by the territorial court and that, in the meantime, the investigation proceeded. Webb went away and came back the following morning with a different argument, and Petty listened to that one too and gave him the same answer. Vivian spent those days in a boarding house near the federal building and learned what the aftermath of crisis felt like. Not relief, but a strange, suspended state, like the moment after you've let go of something very heavy and your arms are still shaking from the weight of it. She slept more than she'd slept in a week. She ate regular meals. She walked the streets of Laramie in the mornings and thought about Caldwell Creek and about what she was going to do next. Garrett stayed. She hadn't asked him to. He'd simply stayed, and when she'd mentioned it, he'd said that he had things to attend to in Laramie and hadn't specified what things. She suspected the things were largely the same as her things, but she didn't push it. On the 4th day, Cord Petty summoned Silas Hargrove to Laramie for questioning. She found out about it from the deputy, not from Petty, and she sat with that information in her boarding house room for a long time. She thought about the schoolroom and his hand on her wrist, and the way he'd said Wednesday as he walked out, as though Wednesday were already agreed upon, as though her compliance were simply a matter of timing. She thought about the Telford family, about what a letter that says handle him in the usual way meant for Mrs. Telford and whatever children they'd had and whatever life they'd built before someone had decided that life was an obstacle. She thought about all the things that powerful men assume are already decided. On the 5th day, Elbert Fossey arrived in Laramie in federal custody. Vivian was not in the room when he was questioned. She was not entitled to be. But Garrett was in the hallway of the federal building when Fossey was brought in, and he told her afterward that Fossey had looked like a man who had known for some time that this moment was coming and had not quite prepared for it adequately. Pale, careful, keeping his eyes on the floor. "He'll talk," Garrett said. "How do you know?" "Because he looked at the marshal like he was looking for permission," Garrett said. "Not like a man who's going to fight it. Like a man who's been wanting to put it down for a long time and is waiting for someone to tell him he can." He was right. Fossey's testimony took 3 hours. Vivian didn't know its full contents until later. What came out in the formal proceeding piece by piece over the following weeks. But what she knew within 24 hours was this. Fossey confirmed the payment records. Fossey confirmed that the deed transfers were fraudulent. Fossey confirmed that he had been told, on 4 separate occasions, to process deed transfers without the knowledge or consent of the landowners, using forged signatures. And Fossey confirmed that when he'd expressed reluctance, twice, early on, he had been visited by a man who worked directly for Silas and who had made the nature of his continued employment and continued health very plain. Fossey was not a good man. He had done what he'd done for money and out of fear, and those were not excuses. But he had also, at the end, told the truth, and that counted for something, even if it was a smaller something than Vivian would have preferred. Silas Hargrove arrived in Laramie on the 6th day. She saw him on the street, by accident. She had not planned to see him. She'd been walking back from the telegraph office, where she'd sent a message to a contact at the Cheyenne paper, and she turned a corner, and there he was, coming out of a building with 2 men she didn't know and the lawyer Webb. He saw her at the same moment. He stopped. She stopped. Webb and the two men kept moving for 2 steps before realizing Silas wasn't with them. On the street in Laramie, in the middle of the morning with people passing on either side, Silas Hargrove looked at Vivian Ashcroft. Not the way he'd looked at her in the schoolroom, not with that patient, settled certainty. This was different. This was the look of a man who had calculated the ending and found it different from what he'd planned, and who was still, even now, recalculating. She looked back at him. She did not say anything. She didn't need to. The ledger was in Cord Petty's locked filing cabinet. Fossey's testimony was in a sealed deposition. Clara Becker's statement and Frank Dolan's statement were part of an official federal record. The 6 sheets of transcribed ledger contents were in Iris Calhoun's keeping in Rawlins, and a copy was with the Cheyenne paper, and the truth had been put in enough places that there was no longer any single document to take, no single person to silence, no Wednesday deadline that meant anything. She had done what she came to do. She walked past him. She heard Webb say something low and urgent behind her, and she didn't turn around. She kept walking to the end of the block, and then she stopped and put one hand flat against the wall of the building beside her, and stood there for a moment, because her legs were not entirely steady, and she thought she deserved 30 seconds to be not entirely steady before continuing. Garrett found her there. She didn't know how. He seemed to have a particular ability to locate her when things had just happened, which she eventually concluded was less mystical than it seemed, and more a function of knowing where she'd been going and approximately when. "You saw him," Garrett said. "Yes." "You all right?" "Yes." She took her hand off the wall. Her legs were steady again. "I will be." He stood beside her, not touching her, not filling the silence with unnecessary words. That, she thought, was something she'd come to understand about him over the course of 5 days and several hundred miles. He knew the difference between silence that needed filling and silence that needed to be left alone. "It's not over," she said. "The legal process is going to take months. His lawyers will fight everything. There will be continuances and challenges, and probably some of it will get thrown out." "Probably," he agreed. "But Fossey testified, and the investigation is federal now. And his lawyers can fight the chain of evidence arguments all they want, but they can't unring the bell." She straightened. "Silas Hargrove is going to spend the next year in legal proceedings that are going to cost him more than the land was worth, and everyone in the territory is going to know why." "The Cheyenne paper?" "I sent the telegraph this morning. They're expecting the documents by the end of the week." She paused. A story in the territorial paper turns a legal proceeding into a public record. It becomes something people talk about, something other families who lost land to similar operations can point to. She looked down the street, away from the direction she'd come. That was always the part that mattered most. Not just stopping Silas, changing what's possible. Garrett considered this. "You were thinking about all of that while we were in the canyon?" "I was thinking about whatever was immediately in front of me in the canyon," she said. "But yes, before the canyon and after." He looked at her for a moment with that quality of attention she'd learned to recognize. Not intense exactly, but complete. "What are you going to do after Laramie?" he said. It was the question she'd been asking herself for 2 days without arriving at an answer. "I don't know," she said. "Caldwell Creek isn't an option anymore, even if the case goes well. The school board will have replaced me already, and even if they hadn't, I spent 5 days running through mountains from the most powerful man in 3 counties. The quiet life of that particular town is probably not recoverable." She paused. "There are other towns." "There are. There are other schools that need teachers." "There are." She looked at him. "Are you going to just agree with everything I say?" "I'm agreeing because you're right," he said. "I'm not agreeing to be agreeable." He shifted his weight, the slight adjustment of a man who is about to say something he's been considering for some time and is not entirely sure how to say it. "The ranch is in better shape now than it was when my father died. Not good shape. It needs work. But the land is solid and the water's good, and there's a school about 8 miles east that's been without a teacher for 6 months because nobody wants to come that far out." She looked at him. 8 miles is manageable on a horse," he said. "If the horse knows the route." She held his gaze. "Garrett, I know it's not a simple thing," he said. "I know we've had a strange week, and strange circumstances make everything feel different from how it actually is. I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I'm not saying it has to be anything. I'm saying that the land is there and the school needs a teacher, and Clover clearly knows the route between my place and that school already because she's been going in that general direction for 5 days. He paused. And I would like to know you somewhere that isn't a mountain trail with riders behind us. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about Missouri and her father's house and the teacher's college, and the day she'd seen the advertisement for the position in Caldwell Creek, and felt, for the first time, the pull of something that was not yet visible to her. She thought about 28 children in a schoolroom and Carl Bauer's cattle drawing, and Ruth Becker, who had learned long division because she wanted to beat her brother, and the particular satisfaction of watching a child understand a thing they hadn't understood before. She thought about a man who'd given her bread in the dark without asking for anything, and said, "I'll take first watch," and sat at a fire, listening to her talk about children he'd never met, really listening, not waiting. "The school needs a teacher," she said. 6 months empty. That's a long time. Children are falling behind. She almost smiled. That's not a fair argument. No, he agreed, but it's true. She looked down the street at the federal building where Cord Petty was building a case, piece by piece, that would take months to resolve. She looked at the satchel in her hand, which was lighter now than it had been. The ledger locked in a cabinet, the letter in an official record, the work of carrying it this far largely done. She had carried it as far as it needed to go. "I'll need to be available for the depositions," she said. "Laramie's a day's ride. And I'd need to see the schoolhouse before I committed to anything." That's reasonable. "And meet whatever board or parents are involved." Also reasonable. "I'm not agreeing to anything except looking," she said. "That's all I asked," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. In the morning light of a Laramie street, without the urgency of the past 5 days pressing everything into sharper focus, he looked more ordinary than he had in the mountains, tired, in clothes that needed washing, with the jaw that perpetually needed shaving and the worn hat that had lost every argument with the weather. He was not a man who presented himself as anything other than what he was. She'd found, over the course of a hard week, that this was rarer than it should be. "All right," she said. "I'll look." Silas Hargrove was formally charged on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. 4 counts of land fraud, conspiracy to defraud homestead claimants, and 1 count of being a party to the death of Amos Telford. The last charge was the most difficult to make stick, and everyone knew it, including Cord Petty, who had told Vivian privately that the Telford charge would be fought in court for a long time before any resolution came. But it was filed. It was on the record. Mrs. Telford, who came forward after reading about the case in the Cheyenne paper, gave a deposition that included things she'd been afraid to say for 2 years. Vivian sat in the hallway of the federal building the morning the charges were filed and read the Cheyenne paper's coverage, which had run 3 days earlier and which she was reading for the 4th time. It was a long piece, detailed, sourced carefully, and it named names. It named Silas, it named Fossey, it named the holding company and the deed clerk, and the payment amounts and the 17 families and their acreages. At the bottom of the piece, it also named Vivian Ashcroft, former schoolteacher of Caldwell Creek, who had brought the evidence out of the mountains on foot and horseback and delivered it to federal authorities after a 5-day journey that included being pursued by armed riders. She didn't entirely like the way that sentence read. It was slightly dramatic, slightly inaccurate, and left Garrett entirely out of it, which was wrong. But she understood that the newspaper needed a story with a center, and a woman schoolteacher who'd carried evidence through mountain passes was a more legible center than the full complicated truth of it. Garrett sat down beside her in the hallway. "They filed," he said. "I know. I heard Petty come out." She folded the paper. "The Telford charge is going to be hard." "Petty thinks it'll hold?" "Petty thinks it'll be argued for 2 years and then resolve in the territory's favor, which means Silas will be in legal proceedings for 2 years minimum." She set the paper on the bench beside her. "His land operation is suspended pending the investigation. He can't transfer, sell, or encumber any of the disputed properties. Fossey has turned territory's witness." She paused. "The machine is stopped." Garrett looked at the federal building's opposite wall, which was not interesting but was apparently worth looking at for a moment. "The families," he said. "Will they get the land back?" "Some will. The cases where the deed forgeries are documented clearly, those are the strongest. Others may get compensation rather than the land itself, depending on what's happened to the properties since the transfer." She was honest about it, because she'd asked petty and gotten an honest answer. It's not going to be everything for everyone. The law doesn't always return exactly what was taken, but it returns something, and it makes a record, and it means the next Silas Hargrove in the next territory has a precedent to contend with. Garrett nodded. That's what I've been telling myself, Vivian said, that the precedent matters, that the record matters, that a thing being imperfect doesn't mean it wasn't worth doing. She paused. Some days I believe it more easily than others. Which kind of day is today? She thought about it. Medium, she said, leaning toward believing it. He almost smiled. That's probably the honest answer. She looked at him. I was not a man who wanted things cleaned up into something tidier than they were, which was, she had come to understand, both a characteristic she valued, and occasionally one that made him difficult, because sometimes the honest answer was harder to sit with than a simpler one. She thought she was probably the same way, and that two people who both defaulted to the honest answer were either going to find that useful or deeply inconvenient, and possibly both. The school board in Millhaven wants an answer by the end of the month, she said. Millhaven was the town 8 miles east of Garrett's ranch. She had ridden out to see it 2 weeks ago. A small schoolhouse, 23 students, a board of 4 local ranchers who had interviewed her with a combination of skepticism and visible relief and offered her the position before she'd finished answering the second question. The schoolhouse needed work. The living quarters attached to it needed more work. But the children, the 4 who'd been brought in to meet her, had been exactly the kind of children she'd been teaching for 3 years. Curious, slightly suspicious of adults, and entirely capable of more than they'd been given credit for. What are you going to tell them? Garrett said. Yes, she said. I decided last week. I was waiting to tell you in person. He looked at her. 8 miles is manageable, she said, and the children are falling behind. Something in his face shifted, not dramatically, the way things shift in stories, but the way they shift in real life, which is smaller and quieter and more durable. He nodded once, a single solid thing. I'll fix the roof before winter, he said, on the living quarters. There's also a window that doesn't close properly. I'll do the window too. And the front steps are... Vivian. What? I'll fix everything that needs fixing, he said. That's not complicated. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. I suppose it isn't. That winter was the hardest in the territory in 6 years. Heavy snow in November, a cold snap in December that lasted 3 weeks. The kind of sustained weather that tested everything and everyone. Vivian taught school through all of it, riding the 8 miles to Millhaven 5 days a week on Clover, who had opinions about snow but went anyway. By February, she had 19 of her 23 students reading above their previous level, which was not a miracle, but was what happened when children were taught with attention and consistency and the clear expectation that they were capable. She got a letter from Clara Becker in January. Clara had been called to testify in the federal proceeding in December. She'd taken the train to Laramie, left the children with a neighbor, stood in front of federal officials, and said what she knew in a clear and steady voice, and come home. The letter said that she didn't know yet what the outcome would be for her land specifically, but that saying it out loud, in a room with official people writing it down, had changed something she hadn't expected. She'd stopped carrying it the way she'd been carrying it, like a secret, and that the setting it down, even temporarily, even before the resolution, had made her feel like a person with a future instead of a person with only a past. Vivian read that letter 3 times. She wrote back and told Clara about the school and about the winter and about the 2 students who were in competition about everything, which reminded her of Ruth, and she asked Clara to give Ruth her love when she saw her. Frank Dolan testified in February. His testimony was the most detailed of any witness and the most damaging to Silas's legal arguments about the pattern of behavior, because Frank Dolan had kept records of everything, dates, names, conversations, the sequence of events that had followed his refusal to sell. He'd kept them in a notebook he'd never expected anyone to look at, just because he was the kind of man who wrote things down, and that notebook turned out to matter enormously. In March, Elbert Foss was sentenced. 18 months, suspension of his county position, full cooperation with the ongoing federal investigation. It was not a heavy sentence, and Vivian knew it, and she sat with that knowing for a few days before she was able to see it as what it actually was. A transaction, Fossey's testimony, in exchange for a reduced consequence,
the kind of imperfect mechanism by which the law moves towards something better than nothing. She went back to teaching on a Thursday, and by Friday she was absorbed in a lesson about rivers and water systems and had mostly stopped thinking about Fosse's sentence. She had learned, over the winter, something about herself that she'd suspected but not confirmed. She could hold two things at once. She could be angry about what the law hadn't done while being glad about what it had. She could know that the resolution was incomplete while believing that incomplete was better than nothing. She could miss Caldwell Creek and not want to go back. She could find Millhaven small and also find it sufficient. These were not contradictions exactly. They were just the way things actually were, as opposed to how they were in the kinds of stories where resolution meant everything being set right and everyone feeling one clear feeling about it. Real resolution was messier. It required more patience. It felt less like victory and more like the end of a particular kind of effort after which a different kind of effort began. Silas Hargrove's primary fraud case was resolved in April of the following year. He was convicted on 3 of the 4 fraud counts. The Telford charge was reduced. Petty had been right about the difficulty, but it did not disappear entirely. He was sentenced to 7 years in the Territorial Penitentiary, and the judgment included the forced dissolution of the holding company and the return of documented fraudulent deed transfers to their original holders. 11 of the 17 families got their land back. 6 got compensation instead, because in those cases the land had been developed or transferred in ways that made direct return legally complicated. The compensation was not equivalent to the land itself. It never is. And Vivian understood that for some of those families, money was not what they'd lost, and money was not what would make them whole. What she could tell herself, honestly, was that it was something. That those names in the ledger were not just names anymore. They were people in a federal record, people the law had been made to see and respond to. She wrote the final figure, 11 families returned to their land, in a letter to Iris Calhoun, who wrote back 2 days later with a response that was exactly one sentence. Good. Now what? Vivian sat with that letter and laughed, really laughed. The first time in a while that laughter had come out of something genuinely funny rather than something you laughed at because the alternative was crying. Now what? She folded the letter and put it on her desk and looked out the window of the schoolhouse at the spring afternoon, which was the kind of afternoon that reminded you that seasons were not interested in human drama and were going to proceed regardless. She had 23 students. She had a schoolhouse with a repaired roof and a window that closed properly, and front steps that no longer required you to step carefully on the third one. She had a satchel that she still used every day, though it carried lesson plans now rather than evidence of crimes. She'd thought about replacing it once or twice and had not, because some things become part of you through what you've carried in them. She had, 8 miles down the road, a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, and who had once offered her bread in the dark and a room with a lock, and had never once, in the months since, presented himself as anything other than exactly what he was. That was its own kind of evidence, the best kind, maybe? The kind you collected over time, in ordinary conditions, when there was no crisis to sharpen everything into relief. She thought about the night she'd walked out of Caldwell Creek with a leather satchel and a direction, but no plan. She thought about what it had felt like to be that woman. Not weak, she'd never been weak, but alone in the particular way that comes from not having yet found where you belong and not knowing if you will. She thought about a voice in the dark saying, "You don't walk alone anymore," and how she'd heard it and thought, "I don't know you well enough to trust that," and how it had turned out to be true anyway. That was the thing nobody told you about trust. It was not a feeling you had about someone. It was the thing they demonstrated over time, in ordinary moments, in the small decisions that didn't seem like much individually, but accumulated into something you could put weight on. You didn't decide to trust someone the way you decided something in a moment of clarity. You looked back one day and realized that without noticing exactly when, you'd started to. The afternoon light shifted on her desk, and she heard the first sounds of students arriving, boots on the repaired steps, voices, the particular organized chaos of 23 children preparing to learn something. She stood and straightened her coat and looked at the door. Outside, a hard winter had given way to spring. 11 families were on their land again. A ledger that had almost never been found had traveled through canyons and mountain tunnels and depositions and newspaper columns and changed something, imperfectly, incompletely, but permanently. And Vivian Ashcroft,
who had walked out of a town alone one October night carrying everything the law needed and nothing else, was exactly where she'd found her way to. She opened the door and the children came in, and she began.